Good afternoon, dear colleagues.
Καλησπέρα, αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι. Ας ξεκινήσουμε, γιατί έχουμε πολλούς και ενδιαφέροντες προσκεκλημένους.
The meeting is web streamed, so the whole of the world can follow our work. And interpretation will be provided in Danish, Dutch, German, English, French, Greek, Hungarian, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, Swedish, Czech, Polish, and Croatian. So interpretation will also be available for all speakers present in the room and those joining remotely, but that is not the case today, so that is very nice as well. If there are no comments, then the agenda can be adopted. And I should also ask to approve the minutes for the committee meeting of the 26th and the 27th of October. If there are no objections raised, the minutes are adopted. Let me quickly say a few announcements. First of all, the extension of the term of office of the COVID Special Committee. Let me inform you that following the coordinators' decision of the 25th of October, a request to the Conference of Presidents for a 3-month extension of the term of office of the COVID Special Committee, linked with the plenary vote of the report on the July part session in next year, has been launched. And our request will be considered at the COP meeting of the 24th of November, so we will soon have news on that. So take into with your work for next year. Still a lot of hearings to come up. There will be a timetable. I don't know whether it's already distributed or adjusted. No, not yet. We will make you a timetable, as we have discussed in the coordinators as well, and in cooperation with our rapporteur on the report of our COVID committee. So that is very important. And so we will have normally the final vote with this extension in the July plenary session. In November and December, the COVID Committee will embark on a series of discussions to assess the socio-economic consequences of the pandemic. So the first part was on the health issues, the second on the global issues, and now we come to the next pillar, which is the socio-economic impact, and we will do that today, the 28th and the 29th. Today we have next to me the International Labour Organization, but also representatives of unions and other organizations following today. And the 28th and the 29th, we will examine the gender perspective, the impact of the pandemic on vulnerable people, and the EU support mechanisms developed and put in place to sustain the EU economy in the event of the pandemic. Also, Commissioner Dalli and Commissioner Gentiloni, the one for equality and the other for economy, will be included. And finally, on the 8th of December, we will conclude the socio-economic impact with a separate hearing on the impact of the pandemic on children. So a lot of work ahead of us, but let me now go immediately to the exchange of view with Lieve Verboven, Director of the ILO EU Office. Well, key insights from the ILO Global Summit on COVID-19 and the World of Work, including the 10th edition of the ILO Monitor on the World of Work, whether the labour market adapted during and after the pandemic, and what is needed both at an international scale as well as a European scale to make our labour markets more resilient to prepare for the next crisis. I think when you look to the socio-economic, what is happening on that global labour market and the EU labour market is, I think, very important. So I give you immediately the floor, Mrs. Verboven, for about 10 minutes. We have like 45 minutes altogether for this first part, so we have to step up, but please take your time to explain to us and give us your introductions. Mrs. Verboven, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to everyone here present. It's a pleasure for me to be opening, in a way, this new session, new pillar discussion on the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. What I will do in my intervention is focus indeed on the socio-economic impact, but also look a bit ahead of your next pillar, which is EU and the world. And I will also integrate some of the concerns that you have on gender in setting the scene on how has COVID-19 impacted the world of work. I will base my intervention on the latest ILO monitor, the 10th ILO monitor, which was published end of October, and you may have received the link to it through your secretariat. I will set the scene in numbers, total numbers, but then also looking at the rising inequalities for men, women, for quality of employment, and for geographically how have different regions experienced the pandemic impact. And of course, I will look at some recommendations that came out of our analysis, but also from the work within the ILO. And I'm just preempting that you know what the ILO stands for. It's the International Labour Organization, the one UN agency that has not just governments among its constituents of the 187 member states, but also workers' organizations and employers' organizations. They are part of our governing body, part of the conference, and we're a normative in organization, which means that there are conventions coming out of the annual conferences, just as between brackets to have everyone on the same page. Good. What does the ILO monitor? What does it learn when we look at the pandemic in terms of numbers? Well, we've seen that there has been no crisis as this one before. No, not even the 2008-2009 financial crisis had this impact. 4 times higher. That's what the impact has been on employment of this crisis. 2020, the equivalent loss of full employment jobs was 255 million. When we look at percentages, we can say it is -9% compared to pre-COVID times, the end of 2019. That's our, let's say, our reference period. So that's 9% of jobs were destroyed when we look at 2020. When we look at the third quarter of 2022 estimates, we see that there has been a loss in full-time equivalent jobs of 40 million. So we're at a better pace now globally, but still not where we were, not at all. And when we look at the share of income from labor, then there is a loss of 4.4% of global GDP. So the income from labor has also fallen. Now, looking at the impact, it can only be relevant when you look at it more deeper. So what does it mean for men and women? What does it mean in terms of quality of employment and regions? So let me first take you to that other rising inequalities between men and women because of the impact of the pandemic. In 2020, we've seen that women were hardest hit by the pandemic. 3.6% of women's employment was destroyed compared to 2.9% of men's employment. And the greatest loss was in the region of the Americas, followed by Asia Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, and then Africa. Now, still in 2021, there were less women in employment than compared to before the pandemic than for men. So these inequalities remain. And has also then consequences for gender pay gap and gender gap in general in labor force participation, which stands at 25.3% less participation in labor market for women than for men. And why is that? Obviously, women were working in sectors that were hardest hit by the pandemic. Food industry, accommodation. When I say food industry, I mean food services like restaurants, accommodation, manufacturing sector, and that has that consequence. Now, the increasing inequalities are equal regardless of the income of the country. All income groups are affected, and particularly the middle income countries. Now, there is another dimension of the impact of COVID, which is the quality of the employment. And there, if you look at it globally, informal workers, and in many regions, the vast majority of workers are informal workers, they have been hit hardest. Out of the 2 billion informal workers worldwide, almost 1.6 billion have been hit by the pandemic, leading to 60% decline of their income when we look at the peak of the pandemic. Also interesting to see now in the recovery phase that where we have seen employment growth, that the most rapid growth has been in informal jobs. Now, is that a good sign or is it a bad sign? We would say it's not such a good sign because it puts under threat the progress that has been made over the past 15 years of formalizing the informal economy. And among informal workers, we also see that the migrant workers who are often working in this informal economy are the ones that bear most of the negative impacts of this, because it's not only their jobs that has been lost, it's also the access to social protection that is then lacking. My last comparison is among regions. So how does it look like, this impact? If we look at the different regions, we see that now in the recovery phase, there are very big differences. And it may surprise you, but the recovery, the best performer in the recovery phase are the Americas, with a gain in working hours, even more now in the second quarter of 2022, an increase of 0.2% compared to the third quarter in 2019. That's very significant and in a very stark contrast with other regions. We see Africa and Arab states that they come in with an upward trend, but they're not yet at pre-COVID level, still 2% less hours worked than before. And then we see Asia and Pacific with a slight decline, so stalling recovery. And we also see Europe and Central Asia with 2 consecutive quarters of declines, a cumulative loss of 1%. So we look at regions that way, but we also look at income groups of countries. And if you look at income groups of countries, then we have another trend that we observe, which is that high-level income countries will do better than low-income and lower middle-income countries. They continue to be affected more than the others. And this has prompted the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the UNGA, the latest UN General Assembly, to speak about the great divergence. And as a real challenge now for the world entirely, not just for the world of work, but the world overall, because this rising inequalities may affect other dimensions, may create social unrest in many countries, affects income, affects also purchasing power losses and reduced demand, which puts again the economy under stress and maybe also the supply chains. So that's a little bit the outline of what our ILO Monitor report says. We also have, importantly, a number of analyses on care workers, which has played a crucial role in societies and which revealed many gaps during the COVID pandemic, especially if we look at gender gaps there. But there are also some positives to be mentioned there. One is that at the ILO, the annual conference, the conventions that relate to occupational health and safety to provide for a safe and healthy workplace, they have now been elevated as a fundamental right. And another positive on care, we could say also, is that the EU, the Commission, has recently launched its care strategy and also calls upon the EU member states to ratify Conventions 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work and on 189 on domestic workers. And why do I speak about that? And I will finalize rapidly with the recommendation, because that's one of the recommendations. One of the key recommendations is you have to look at social protection. And when you look, for example, at the domestic workers, it's just recently that Spain, during the COVID pandemic, has realized that their domestic workers were not sufficiently covered by social protection, by unemployment benefits, etc., has passed legislation, has extended social protection to migrant domestic workers. And that's one of the gains after this pandemic, one of the lessons learned that is now a takeaway. So that's an example of what should be done. And it's also then that they have ratified Convention 189. And I call upon you as members here in the COVI committee to also support this and go back to your countries, if not ratified yet, to call upon ratification of those conventions. Now, in looking at the recommendations, of course, for ILO, where we sit the whole world together, workers, employers, and countries, we come up with global recommendations that are quite vast and generic, but they're there, and they're important to mention that achieving universal social protection is key. It's seen as an essential tool to maintain purchasing power and also to alleviate poverty. And there's many examples, not just the one from Spain that I gave, that work well. Now it's a question of making them sustainable, not just temporarily. The other instrument that's been put in place is a global accelerator on jobs and social protection. It's a UN instrument that we will roll out to create productive jobs, investing in green economy, in digital economy, and the care economy. Third, we say that we have to look at job creation and formalization. So we work on one of the sectors, for example, is the growing sector is platform work. So in that light, also what EU is doing, the work that's been done on platform work is being monitored by ILO. Continue to work on reducing gender gaps and investing in labor rights and social dialogue are also key in tackling any other consequences of the socio-economic impacts of the COVID pandemic. I see my time is up, and I'm ready to answer all your questions during the Q&A. Looking forward to it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lieve Verboven. I think an excellent introduction of this pillar, a broad overview, both globally, domestically, with clear figures and a clear focus on, well, which were the vulnerable groups during that pandemic. Very, very important for us to start this debate. Mr. Kimporopoulos, to start the question.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I would also like to thank Director Verboven for being with us today and for your very concrete input and the issues that you have raised. But I would like to give us some other perspectives on the following issues. One of the many bright lessons learned from the pandemic was the harnessing the benefits of technology to telework and have flexibility. It gives us the opportunity to sustain economic activity throughout difficult time while enabling people to fulfill their care responsibilities of children and elderly people. So I would like to ask you, do you see it as a well-established trend or workplaces gradually shift to the pre-pandemic status quo? Secondly, the pandemic put a huge strain on the mental health and well-being of many citizens, including the self-employed and young people at the beginning of their careers. In this parliament, this is something we take very seriously. In fact, on a number of occasions, this parliament, we have stressed that mental health is the next health crisis, and we have also stressed the need for a holistic EU strategy. How have states within the broader European area have coped with that? And another question, is there any evidence that they start integrating mental health care with physical care and expand the number of relevant services? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Kutayar, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks also, Ms. Verboven, for being with us today. I wanted to bring forward a couple of points and questions for your gentle feedback. First and foremost, you spoke about the geographical differences amongst the different continents and regions, and here I wanted to ask also whether your study goes into more regional differences, in the sense that when we speak of the center, the urban areas vis-a-vis the peripheral and more rural areas, because here there are also some differences which may have been accentuated by the pandemic. So that's an area which we work upon as European Parliament also when it comes to cohesion policy and within the Regi Committee, and I'm mostly interested in this regard. Then yes, when it comes to disadvantaged aspects, apart from the disadvantaged regions, we must look at vulnerable groups in the workforce. You mentioned also the gender perspective, which I will touch upon a bit later, but here we must not forget also, for example, people living with obesity and other vulnerable groups. And we need to ensure that these groups are also helped for future crises when it comes to the continuance of the participation in the labour market. So I'll appreciate any comments in this regard. Then another question relates to whether you've went into the quiet quitting phenomena, and is this phenomena in the EU as strong as in the US? What are the pros and cons for the workforce and the economy in this regard? And going back to the gender perspective, which is very much at heart as a member of the Gender Mainstreaming Network myself, I'm very much interested in the way the pandemic has affected women working at the front line in this regard. And while we do make serious efforts to always build towards a comprehensive approach to gender inequality, I find that every crisis that comes, first COVID-19 and now the energy crisis, disproportionately affects women and females, depending also on this gender aspect, which is really there as a fact. And therefore, in this regard, you mentioned several recommendations from ILO as to how to address the gaps and also the realities we face. And I wanted to ask, from these recommendations, do you pinpoint towards any one or other which may especially help to address the gender gaps when it comes to the unpaid workload, the career visibility, and also long-term consequences for career progression and the pay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Verboven, sorry. We do some questions and then answers.
Okay, thank you very much. I already have a chance to try to comment on your interventions. So I think you've understood from the intervention I made that the number one recommendation is clearly to work on social protection, sustainable social protection mechanisms. So indeed, that would help challenging situations where breadwinners are now maybe out of work or have had to transfer to another sector which is less well paid, or where the package that comes with it is well not as good. So trying to harness all of that is indeed important, and I think there are many measures that have been taken by the EU, and I know you will have a dedicated sessions with the competent commissioners on it, but then surely they will put into light what has been done under the SURE component. I think those were measures that help maintain a certain level of income through unemployment benefits that were our short-term relief that were given to breadwinners, or workers that were put out of job temporarily because of lockdowns, etc. And so we, as ILO, we saw that in countries that they put in place these kind of mechanisms, that indeed that helped a lot to make sure that people did not fall into poverty right away. You asked about data related to rural and urban differences. We don't have them on a global scale, so we cannot, we did not make our estimates with those variations. We may have ad hoc country analysis that may take that into account, but not one that comes immediately into my mind. If I find them, I will convey them directly to you, as it may be useful for also input into your committee cohesion between regions. As for vulnerable groups, definitely important for any policy to be made, and a lot of the policy in social affairs is a national competency, of course, in EU member states. So when we look at the national competency in social affairs and in labor and employment, it is to really tailor it towards the vulnerable groups, so that the support that is being given through social protection or in employment creation or through training, etc., that the factor of compounding vulnerabilities is taken into account. So yes, you may have categories, if you then speak of categories of being in a disability, having female gender, etc., etc. So the compounding vulnerabilities definitely are to be taken into account in designing policies. Another question was with regards to quiet quitting. What has been observations made on a global level? We've seen, let's say, it's more maybe a phenomenon that occurs in Europe or in the States, not so much in the rest of the world. We see just brutal quitting, meaning losses of jobs. So it's not a global phenomenon. And on the question whether we could pinpoint specific measures to be taken to address rising gender inequalities, I think at the global level, what can help, besides all a smart mix of measures, is those latest ILO conventions on violence and harassment in the world of work definitely have a big gender dimension, and they're true for everywhere in the world, that a healthy and safe working environment is also a productive environment. It's one where talents of all workers come across, and you don't chase or you don't leave behind workers that feel unsafe. So that's definitely an important one to be taken into account, as well as the one on domestic workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Trélène-Leroy.
Thank you, Chair. Je vais parler en français.
I'm going to speak French, Director. I see that you understand it. So thank you very much for your presentation. And against the backdrop of recurrent crises and uncertainty about the health situation, which makes businesses more difficult to manage, and given the crisis in Ukraine and the rising energy prices, there is a group in the midst of all this which I think is very vulnerable, young people. I think young people have been particularly affected by the lockdown measures, and they have had to learn remotely, whether they be at school or at university. Some of them have had to work from home for the first time ever. It's becoming more and more difficult for them to enter the workplace, and they have been struck by a lot of emotional issues as well. So do you have any specific studies about the younger generations? And are there any specific initiatives, social protection initiatives or mechanisms? And what are the professional opportunities or prospects for these young people who have been disproportionately affected by the COVID crisis?
Please.
Ja, auch ich werde Deutsch sprechen.
I shall speak German. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to focus on certain categories that haven't been mentioned yet. Patients, those who have long COVID, those who've suffered from vaccinations, and young people, they have been mentioned already. I think that, this is a group of people that are like in the shade, in the background. People aren't talking about them. In Germany, there are some 300,000 people suffering from long COVID at EU level. Well, I don't think we have any specific figures. So what do you think about that? What measures are being taken? Because there are different levels of suffering for these people. What about recognition of these illnesses? I think that's very important as well. What about young people who've had to interrupt their studies, or who can only work part-time, if at all? So what is being done about them? Are you aware of them? Do you know the full extent of this phenomenon with this particular group of people? Because it seems that this is a category of people that needs our full support. It seems to me just at the beginning, really, and I'd like to have more information from you about that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I also would like to highlight another vulnerable group, which you did not mention, and I'm speaking of people that are mRNA vaccine-free people. We have seen widespread discrimination of this group, implementation of COVID pass, which lacks any scientific basis whatsoever. In Germany, for instance, this group of people have been, by state officials, government officials, of high-ranking officials of labor unions, been threatened. They may no longer work if they are not injected. They would no longer be eligible for sick pay if sick. They would have to pay for medical treatment themselves. They would not receive medical treatment at all. They have been declared outcasts who have no place in society. They have been accused of killing others, and they have been called vermin. And that last slur especially is so despicable and reminds me of the darkest times we have had in rather recent history. I would like to know, what is your position on this treatment of mRNA-free workers? What have you done to stop this abominable treatment? And secondly, I would like to know, in the constitution of ELO, it it starts out by saying, world peace can only be achieved through social justice. In case you have not done anything to stop this treatment, as mentioned, is it your position that social justice has been served by treating unvaccinated people like this? Thank you.
Mevrouw Verboven.
Thank you, Chair. I'm answering now in the order I received in English. Merci pour votre question, Madame Trillet.
Thank you very much, Ms. Driller, for your question.
The question was with regards to young people. If we have any analysis done? Yes, we have special report on the impact of the COVID on youth employment, and the impact of youth on youth employment has shown that the impact has been 3 times higher than for adults. So your globally, what you have seen and what feedback that you've seen about the suffering by youth in many dimensions is also verified by the evidence that we have gathered. So, as I said, 3 times higher. And in the report that I will forward to you, a lot of recommendations have been given for especially those young people at the peak of the COVID pandemic that were not just finishing their education or just entering the labor market, because they just missed that stepping stone. Those 2 crucial years were the most important almost in entering the labor market or finishing their studies. So we talked about the danger even of a lost generation of these youngsters that have been just in that critical phase of going from one education to entering the labor market. And they may take a lot of time to catch up the step back that they had to take over the course of their career. So I would refer to that report to go to more details of it. On long COVID, Ms. Langensiepen, what measures have been taken? What about the recognition? And you've mentioned the number of 300,000 of long COVID patients in Germany. We don't have a detailed study that is global on what long COVID has. And what it will entail for the labor market in the long run. So definitely a gap at the moment, and something that can be pinpointed at because it will be important, especially now in some regions, as in Europe, where we have shortages on labor market for high-skilled people. If you are not dealing with this issue of long COVID, if there is not enough care, if there is no cure, etc., then it's to the detriment not only of those patients, but for the society, because it's a loss of talent, a loss of potential workers. Then Ms. Anderson, if I read your name correctly, Anderson, yes, questions about discrimination. And there is indeed an important ILO convention, which is a fundamental convention. It's on non-discrimination. And the non-discrimination can be on various dimensions. The very specific question whether it can be discriminated against because of a vaccine as a question itself to one of our supervisory bodies has not been examined as such, so there is not an ILO position on it. But what we have seen and observed in certain countries is workers and employers, for example, organizations, agreeing in a framework agreement that there cannot be discriminated against workers for being being hit by the COVID pandemic, suffering from it. So in parallel also not for being vaccinated or not in a way. But of course there are elements of safety as well. So there are different things that come into play also with regards to the protection of other workers. So it all depends there. The question itself, from a technical point of view, whether it falls under our convention has not been tackled so far as to my knowledge. Over to the chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Teres.
Thank you so much. I was listening carefully to the data that you shared with us based on the research that your organization had done about the way people and businesses were affected by the COVID crisis. And one of the issues is the increase of unemployment and the fact that people lost their jobs, mainly women, and implicitly many businesses had to close down. And we know now, looking back, that one of the reasons is the lockdowns. So my first question is, if your organization actually analyzed the way these lockdowns were done, if there was enough data behind those decisions, and if looking back, those lockdowns were, I would say, appropriate, legit or not. The second issue is in regards to the digital green certificate, which goes beyond the injections with mRNA vaccines. Because the digital green certificate was the tool used by governments, businesses, and other entities to actually restrict the fundamental right to work of many people, including members of the European Parliament and people who are working here. So the first question that I have to you in regards to the second topic is, what is the position of your organization on the digital green certificate itself? If you had any analysis, if you had any public position, and if you took a stand in regards to it. The second question in regards to this position is if your organization had any public position in regards to this or not, and nevertheless, if a similar crisis will happen in the future. Is your position in favor of such a digital certificate or not? Thank you.
Mrs. Matthias, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was listening also to your presentation with much interest. Although you have just made some references to that, I would like to come back to some of the issues related with the most vulnerable. And if you could please say to us make some additional comments on the measures needed to improve the working conditions, especially of those workers in mobility, as they were some of the most affected during the pandemic, and as in particular to their safety and the security in terms of cross-boarding, because, for instance, here in the European Union, and we are here in the region where a lot of workers live in one country and work in the other. So this is a very permanent and regular issue to deal with, and it was quite affected. And the second comment I would like also to ask you is on the measures, new measures and new approaches which have been developed concerning the right to disconnect. As during the pandemic, there were a lot of changes in terms of the way we work, and of course here in this house we were already engaged in defining new rules for the right to disconnect. But I would like to know how do you see a common approach also in this area? Thank you.
Okay, that was the final question, and for your final answers, please.
Let me first come back to the questions of Mr. Terrace, which were more going into the direction of ILO's position on certain initiatives, being it legit or not, or recommendable or not. The first one was on decisions made by countries to go into lockdown or not, based on the data available at that time, were they legit or not. I don't think that I can comment for the ILO on that question. I think it's maybe more for the WHO to answer, or for the countries themselves. Definitely what we would say as an ILO, where workers, employers and governments are all three components of the ILO. What we say is very important in taking such drastic decisions which have an impact on the world of work, on the economy, to always consult with the partners involved, with workers and employers organizations. And we have seen that where it was done, it was very helpful to, for example, and I think probably a lot of countries have learned from the first wave compared to the second wave, etc., and have adjusted their strategy, as we all probably learned as we were going through this pandemic, but that it was important to engage with the sector at sectoral level to see what works best. Where do we need to get a lockdown, or where do we have the most impact to have a lockdown for the safety of the public health, for the safety of the economy and the workers in that sector, but to engage with workers and employers organization. I think if there is one recommendation that the ILO gives, it's that one. And definitely on the digital green certificate, there is no ILO position. It's not a type of decision we would look at and express ourselves on. Voilà. Then, Ms. Matthias, you had questions on workers in mobility. I think that's typical for the transport sector, where there are cross-border issues, and it will have to be taken with us for next pandemics. I can give the example of the seafarers. Seafarers, where ILO has done a lot of work to the challenge of many seafarers who were out of nowhere, stuck on a boat without being taken care of. And that was an exaggerated, let's say, forum. Transport sector also has many, in the road transport sector has many examples of where it went, let's say, wrong, or where it can be done better. But for seafarers, a lot had to be done to make sure that people were being taken care of and not stuck on their container ships for months and months and months in a row. Those were the most the questions that I have noted down. I may have missed some, so please remind me of them if I missed to answer those.
I don't see anybody,
No.
so that
Okay,
concludes the first part. En laat me dat ook in het Nederlands zeggen, mevrouw Verboven. Heel erg fijn dat je hier was.
Speak in Dutch now. I think that was a good introduction. I think we had a good assessment of the pandemic. So I think it's good to have the ILO's insight, the multilateral organization, and we will carry on, I think, with the different organizations, finding out more details. So thank you very much for coming. And if you have any questions, then I'm sure we'll know where to find you.
If I can ask Mr. Willem Goudriaan and Mr. Klaas Michael Staal to come to the front here to proceed in our hearings. So, to continue, after this first introduction from the ILO, I welcome Mr. Jan Willem Gouderiaan from the European Federation of Public Services Union and Mr. Klaas Michael Staal from the General European Trade Union Confederation. And I give you immediately the floor, each of you for around 10 minutes. First of all, Mr. Gouderiaan and then Mr. Staal. Mr. Gouderiaan, please, you have the floor. And then after the two introductions, we can go to the Q&A with the members. Please.
Thank you, President, and thank you for the invitation, and also nice to see a number of MEPs with whom we have been working over the last couple of months, almost 2 years, on the issue of COVID-19. First, EPSU. EPSU is the European Federation of Public Service Trade Unions. We represent 8 million workers in public services across Europe, and most of those workers have been fully involved during the pandemic. They had to work and they had to deliver public services. Think of prison guards, think of firefighters, think of workers in the utilities, delivering your water, your electricity, collecting your waste, and also think of those workers in central government administrations who had to deliver the programs to bring money to citizens, money to businesses during the periods of lockout. But first and foremost, of course, the workers in health and social services. And before starting, I think we can pay tribute to those workers for the work they did during the pandemic. I think we have all seen the images on television, hospitals which were overwhelmed with patients and workers who didn't know much about the health and care workers which didn't know much about the disease, but still had to take care in residential care, in home care, and as you know, often unprotected in the beginning. EPSU is the European representative organization representing those workers. And that straight away will be one of the main messages of my contribution, is that we should not forget to put those people who deliver care and other public services, who take care of us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, to put them in the middle, center stage of the work we do, and I hope also in the work the committee does. As was already remarked, many of those women in care are women. Just to remind us, tomorrow is Equal Pay Day in the European Union, where we will draw attention to the fact that many women still earn on average less than men, and that is certainly also due for a large part to the low pay of women in the care sector. EPSU, ETUC, Klaus Michael, and the World Health Organization's Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development have stated that we need to address the deep-seated health, social, economic and gender inequalities exposed by the pandemic. And once again, I think Mrs. Verboven earlier in the session with the ILO raised some of those points as well. The Pan-European Commission has drawn attention to the large inequalities in wealth and in income inequality, the underinvestment in social protection. Mrs. Verboven stressed that a moment ago as contributing to the big disparities in inequality in Europe. And the Commission recommends that we address that. I think this also addresses what many trade unions, NGOs, and I think also many of you here in this House, if you call this House, have addressed. And I think it's worthwhile to look at those recommendations of this Pan-European Commission and possibly include them in your report. The second message, I would say, links very much to that, to acknowledge and address the severity of staffing shortages we have currently in health and in social care. We do know, and I think you do know, that this leads to so-called medical deserts in the European Union. It leads to situations in which people cannot exert their right to health and care. And I think important, it leads also to more expensive solutions through agency work, for example, to address those care those staffing shortages. It's far cheaper to train people than to employ agencies to engage people. So the lack of staff, of course, is mirroring the lack of respect for the work health and care workers do, and the lack of good conditions. And we think this is now a societal issue which also needs collective approaches. And that leads me to a third point. The pandemic, we think, has shown that we need to be prepared, and that preparedness rests on robust, resilient and equipped public services and social protection systems. And I can fully agree with Mrs. Verboven, what she mentioned earlier in her session, the importance of well-developed social protection systems. Obviously, that means public investment and public funding. The Pan-European Commission I referred to earlier calls on countries to address these long-standing gaps in funding in primary care, in mental care. A number of you raised that issue as well as in social care, and while investing and protecting the healthcare workforce. EPSU is a member of the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation, and my colleague and friend Klaus Meijker will address in a moment some of the more general labour market issues. We are very much appreciating the European Parliament for setting up this COVID committee. Maybe some of you remember that together with the European Disability Forum and AIDS, which is the European Organisation for the elderly, we called upon the Commission on the Parliament to set up an investigative commission, because in June 2020 we already saw the immense impact this crisis was having on many people, not least on the elderly, not least on people with disabilities, and the workforce who was dealing with this. So we are very pleased with this COVID committee. We heard recently you extended the mandate to another 3 months for this committee. It's not yet done?
We asked for an extension, but we'll get it. Don't
well,
worry.
Anyway, you have our support for that extension if you need it. You can at least say trade unions are supporting that extension of the mandate, because we do think it is very important to go as far as you can go investigating this, and we look very much forward to your recommendations. For us as healthcare workers, you might remember already one of the first reports of Amnesty International in 2020, I think it was in September, indicated several thousands health and care workers died. So going to the bottom of what went wrong, how these workers were not prepared, we think is very much is very important. Within the trade unions, we advocate for a one health or a one team approach, not only looking at doctors and nurses, but also at the cleaner and other people, medical, paramedical staff in hospitals and care homes, and our preparedness has to cover all those workers. I was looking for the clock, how much time I still have. So preparedness is very important for all of the workers involved. Some of you were present at a meeting we organized in September here in the House with a number of you, in which we had testimonies of health and care workers. And I think, President, you were present at part of that as well as some other members here. And I think the testimony of those workers is heart-wrenching, I think is the English word. I mean, it knocks you over. One of the testimonies of a nurse, a Czech nurse, who was arguing, who was making the point that she was coming home to have to take care for her elderly mother because the services were no longer available, infected her mother who died, and she still had to go back to work in the hospital with being infected herself, even although she was, how do you call it, asymptomatic and not didn't show the symptoms, and still she was called to work. So there are many testimonies like this, and we certainly would welcome to bring those care workers to this House from across the European Union and assist the COVID Committee in listening to them. Think of it, if you have another 3 months, Chair and members of the committee, think of it on the 11th and 12th of March, we celebrate, well, it's not the right word, we remember 3 years of the COVID pandemic, the lockdown, especially here in Belgium and other countries. And I think it would be an excellent moment to also listen to them, how after 3 years they are experiencing the situation. And we certainly are in a position to help you bring that representative voice. One or two other points to end. We find the European Health Union itself is not very strong with regard to the element of planning for staff shortages. We think that is neglected in the European Health Union. Unions are not part of the consultation mechanisms of the various bodies we have now set up. And now you might say, well, unions again. But the employers are not there either. So the social partners are not involved. And I think it is important for employers and trade unions to take the measures which are needed in the sector and to roll them out. Lack of staffing. This House is going to look, I think, also at the mental health strategy proposed by the European Commission. There's not a single word about the lack of staffing in that mental health strategy. I mean, we assume that the workers are there, but they are not there. The mental care nurse or the mental care doctor and all the supporting services, they are not there. And I think it is important to address that. I think a speaker in one of the questions, I think Mr. Kim Pouropoulos raised the issue in his questions about the stress at work for many people. And I think these sort of issues need to be addressed when we talk about a mental health strategy as well. A last point, and I think I've then exceeded my time. We are, as trade unions and employers, lacking a continuous dialogue with DG Health. We don't have a continuous dialogue on many of these issues which are addressed. Is a little bit better with regard to the European Care Strategy, which I hope many points of this you will integrate in your work as well. But we lack that continuous dialogue with the DG responsible for health. That's one of the reasons why on the 9th of December, and if you're around, please come, we will be organizing a demonstration, a rally, before the Health Council, the Health Ministers' Council, to make this point. We need more staffing, we need finance, we need to address pay and conditions of healthcare workers, and we need that social dialogue with also the European Commission. So, we need a response that covers all workers. We need to put workers central stage. And if we want a sector that is attractive for people to work in, so we can address staffing issues, we need to ensure that this sector is offering decent pay and conditions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goudriaan. The things that you mentioned about the medical desert, was something that already was already something that was there before the crisis, of course. It just been strengthened and became very outspoken during the crisis, and it's still there after the crisis. But I think it's very important that you stress that. And the second point that I want to stress as well, before I give the floor to Mr. Staal, is what you said about testimonies. And we'll come back in this committee also on the feedback on the mission to Italy. But in Italy, in the mission there, we had a lot of testimonies of healthcare workers, people in hospitals, the Red Cross, and I agree, this pandemic is not just about facts and figures, but also about what really happened over there and how we take that lessons on board. Mr. Staal, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And let me start by thanking the committee for arranging this hearing today, because there are many reasons to discuss the lessons learned, and it's important to discuss what can be done to avoid and repeat mistakes in the future if another pandemic or another crisis arises. And the fight against COVID-19, in particular the early period, was certainly a mix of setbacks, but also of success stories. And the dilemmas of collective actions can be difficult. The basic question was, as always in times of crisis, are we going to act jointly and together, or is it each and every one on their own? Is it collective action or individual action? And I'm representing the ETUC here today, and it is an organization that was very involved with its affiliates during this period. We faced a number of questions and concerns that we tried to tackle jointly, and we did it through briefing notes, and we tried to create a system of exchange of information and experiences on how to tackle issues that arise. And I would invite you actually to go through our briefing notes that we prepared with affiliates, because they give a very good understanding of the issues that arise during the pandemic, step by step. And there are almost, I would say, an infinite number of issues to raise, and John Willem has addressed some of them, and I will focus on some other ones, but of course it's not going to be covering all the aspects that one would like to discuss in a hearing like this. But so here are at least three things that I would like to mention of importance for the EU level. And the first one is protection of vulnerable groups on the labour market, workers with temporary and atypical contracts, and particularly connected to the SURE mechanism. The second area I would like to say something about is on safe and secure cross-border mobility issues and migration. Thirdly, something on COVID-19 as an occupational disease. So firstly, COVID was a challenge for many groups on our labour markets, but women were particularly hit by the effects of the pandemic, and European states have fallen back on achievements on equality achieved during the last 20 years. Women workers are overrepresented in sectors in which telework was not possible, like food service, care sector, hospitality, wholesale and retail, and I think Jan Willem mentioned more earlier. And women had to devote more time to the care needs of older persons and family members who were ill due to the overwhelmed health services. And young people commonly work in sectors and industries that were particularly vulnerable during the pandemic. And these sectors are also characterized by a large amount of part-time jobs, seasonal precarious contracts, and also undeclared work. The EU instrument SURE was probably one of the most important success stories of the fight against the pandemic. And SURE has been crucial to support job retention schemes during the COVID-19 pandemic. It contributed to the funding of short-time work and income compensation schemes. SURE also succeeded in extending coverage to self-employed, but it was not so effective to address gender gaps or other social risks because there were no guidelines to orientate the use of the SURE funds. So here is an area for improvement, or a lesson to be learned. More social guidelines for future SURE initiatives. Secondly, well, mobility comes in different forms. And one of the groups most severely hit were migrants. The crisis uncovered the deplorable working and living conditions of mobile and migrant workers in Europe, with unsafe workplaces and unsanitary accommodation. And they were therefore easy targets for the virus. The situation was even more fragile considering the lack of effective coverage by social protection. And I think the intervention from Van Borren earlier echoed that insight as well. One of the advices that she had was focus on social protection systems. So here is one important lesson for the future, and that is to ensure that migrants are included in regular jobs with health and social security coverage. Another group of mobile workers that was severely challenged during the pandemic was frontier workers, workers that live in one country and works in another. And they suffer from a lack of cross-border coordination and cooperation, a lack of information, and a number of problems linked to mutual recognition. And I'm sure you have addressed these issues in this committee earlier. But this is also another lesson to be learned, how to improve cooperation between member states in times of crisis. Thirdly, COVID-19 was for a long time not dealt with as an occupational disease. However, this changed on May 18 this year, when the Tripart EU Advisory Committee on Safety and Health at Work reached an agreement on the need to recognize COVID as an occupational disease. And ETUC welcomed the agreement reached by the Advisory Committee to recognize COVID as an occupational disease that is going to provide better protection for workers in the context of the current pandemic and the increased preparedness for potential future pandemics. Because COVID-19, and this is important, COVID-19 is not only a public health issue, but very much an occupational health issue as well. And the recommendation to recognize COVID as an occupational disease will also better equip European workplaces against future pandemics. So, let me also say something on how to protect our workforce resilience for future crises. Because looking backwards at the COVID-19 crisis, in the light of the current cost of life, current cost of living crisis, we need to think more long-term about sustainable and inclusive investments. There is a need for long-term investment in quality job creation, in occupational health and safety, in active labour market policies, in education, in skills and training, and precarious jobs are not sustainable, neither economically nor socially. EU and member states must therefore focus more on the creation of climate-friendly jobs, and we also need more jobs in health, education and other public services. Shortly, we need more of Jan Willem's members. And the economic activity shrank significantly in 2020, but employment levels in the euro area fell only slightly due to the role played by job retention schemes, such as short-time work schemes that were made possible by SURE. Almost in all European countries, trade unions have negotiated agreements that achieve the triple objective of protecting businesses, maintaining employment, resuming our economies and our societies after the pandemic. And it also seems that the more involved social partners were, the faster and more successful the member states got out of the pandemic depression. In the future, instruments like SURE should be accompanied by guidelines in order to have greater social impact and to reach out to the most vulnerable groups in society. Finally, let me also mention one more success story that we seem to take for granted. We actually managed to find a vaccine. We also managed to vaccinate most of our populations. None of that would most likely been possible without joint actions at EU level. We should be happy that we had a European Union at this moment. Otherwise, we would have to invent one when we also had to deal with COVID. And however, at the same time, it's also sad that we still haven't managed to extend our solidarity to all corners of the world. And ETUC, we supported the International Trade Union moments call on the European Commission to take all actions needed to make COVID-19 vaccines available for all, and to support the temporary and targeted TRIPS waiver, and also requested by the European Parliament. And ETUC regrets that the recent revelations, which shows how undue lobbying and threats regarding industry stopped a proposal that was meant to make vaccines widely available in poorer countries. And this is also a lesson to be learned. We need to vaccinate the whole world. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that very broad overview of the different points of view coming from both your unions. Very relevant, I think. Let me go to our speakers on behalf of political groups. Mr. Kimperopoulos, please.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and I would like to thank also both speakers for being with us and for your very comprehensive presentations. But also I would like to thank you, Mr. Gudrian, for his mention on the mental health issue and the need of attention that we need to give in our working forces, because it's an issue that we need to see, very seriously. But I want to take another. I would like to focus on other issues. The need for recognition of the fundamental work, healthcare staff and other frontline workers. It's crucial to continue working on improving their working conditions and making their professions attractive for future generations to come. In this regard, I would like to applaud some of the government actions in this regard, including my country, which has committed to salary increases, but also significant measures to improve work-life balance and gender equality. The Commission has also proposed a care strategy, and some of the recommendations are in the right direction, but a bit timid. Therefore, I wanted to ask you how we can increase this job's attractiveness. Secondly, as you also, Mr. Stoll, mentioned, we have the condition of, we have a new job disease regarding the long COVID. And I would like to ask you, both of you, how has it impacted your members, and what are the necessary measures to accommodate the needs of workers with long COVID symptoms? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Luca, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to connect to the last point my dear colleague just raised. And when we talked with the representative of the ILO just before you came to the stage here, she said that there is no, well, quite good data on long COVID. But when you look to the scientific area, people are quite, there is a consensus that we have like at least 10% of those infected that they established long COVID. And back in September, the WHO already told us that in the European region, we are talking about 17 million people and worldwide about 145 million. So there are numbers on the table. And even though that studies are still going on, and especially as you are the representatives for the workers and the labor workforce, I would like to raise this issue again, because of course our primary goal is to have medical research and really bring a good benefit to those who are suffering from this disease, but also we can look from an economic perspective on this issue. And sometimes this helps, because if people tend to talk about money and everything, because when we talk about this high amount of people, then of course the workforce, also for the people themselves, but also to the companies, they are affected. And so this is why I'm very interested in receiving your information. Like, how do you see this whole disease? Because it's not only a wave coming up, it's already there, and how do we deal with this in the future? And if there are, especially from the trade unions perspective, if we have any recommendations how we deal with this issue in the coming future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give you back the floor. Can you not speak too fast, because for the interpreters, not that you did, but please be aware that the interpretation sometimes had difficulties if you speak too fast. Thanks a lot, Mr. Gouderian, and then Mr.
Thank you. Very shortly, thanks for your question, Mr. Kimpuropoulos, and referring back to the importance of addressing mental health, also with regard to the workforce and improving paying conditions for workers. I agree with you. In the European Care Strategy, there were it is addressed. Also, the path to how to improve paying conditions of care staff is mentioned, and that is through better collective agreements by covering workers, especially in the care sector, through a collective agreement. One of the important points of the European Care Strategy was the reference for member states to appoint a coordinator to develop the care strategy and also to report to the European Commission within the next 12 months. And we did see that as an opportunity to develop at national level, as employers and trade unions, but with governments, the strategy further. Regrettably enough, what we hear through the, how do you call that, the grapevine, is that the member states are weakening especially that part of the care strategy. So we are very concerned about that. In terms of long COVID, I think it's especially, I think the English word is galling, that for those workers in health and care who were amongst the first to contract COVID, among the first to contract long COVID, and many of them seriously, that there in many countries is no compensation available. As trade unions, we argue with member states that there needs to be compensation available, because some of them are now 2 years or 2.5 years later and are losing all these social protection benefits, are losing what they used to have as wages and allowances to help them through, are losing. So it is important that at member state level, and if the European Union can help, that compensation funds are available. In general, and I think that's echoing a point Klaus Michael has addressed, it is very important that COVID-19 is addressed also as a workplace issue. And that means the full benefits of risk assessments, of discussion with the workplace representatives has to be followed.
You know, I can only echo what Jan Willem just said, and one important aspect of COVID as a long-term COVID is, of course, the connection to COVID being categorized as an occupational disease. It is a very important step towards the recognition that long-term COVID needs to have. I would also say that it's at the end of the day, it's very much about resources, having a social welfare system that can deal with it, and again, I think the SURE mechanism is a very good structure to ensure that it is possible to deal with this all over Europe and not only in those places where the resources are large. But I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Trillet-Lenoir, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à tous les deux.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you, Mr. Goujon and Mrs. Howe. Thank you very much indeed for reminding us that the COVID pandemic, of course, had a massive impact on health service staff, and the challenges remain. They remain huge. The pandemic highlighted existing problems and has further exacerbated them. You're right, Mr. Goujon, to talk about the need for health policy in Europe. We're not yet strong enough to be able to tackle these problems, but I do hear some points for hope. Thank you indeed, Mr. Sal, for having pointed out the number of lives that's been saved by vaccinations. That is, of course, self-evident, but all too often people forget that. And it's all too frequently challenged, even within the walls of this committee, by those anti-vaxxers who don't believe in it. But obviously it's critical and indeed vital for democracy that we get across these points. I'd also like to focus on the fact that it isn't just a question of prevention, it's also a question of making available more staff, which means more training. This is a huge problem. It's not the only problem, but it's a very big problem which needs to be addressed, the staffing levels. I'm glad that you are prepared to meet with DG Santé. It occurs to me that the directorate responsible for employment policy in the Commission is also a very relevant DG for you to be contacting. Maybe it would be possible even to have a meeting with the Commissioner, who hitherto hasn't been present in this committee. So really, this is indirectly, Chairman, a suggestion to you that you might perhaps take this up and see if we can get the relevant Commissioner to come along here, which would be very valuable. Then there's another positive point, Mr. Stahl, which you raised, which is the fact that COVID-19 has been recognised as an industrial disease. Now, could you perhaps expand on that? Thank you. Thank you, Veronique.
D'Amato.
Grazie, Presidente. I will speak in Italian.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in Italian. I would just like to ask a question. First of all, on protection of vulnerable workers in the public sector and the private sector too. So essentially, there are large numbers of workers who are at risk because they're immunodepressed or because they suffer from various diseases, cancer, or they're undergoing some kind of life-saving treatment. Could you tell us how many people in each member state were in this kind of category and what the member states actually did by way of response? I think my impression is that is to say that at the beginning, some of these people were allowed to work at home through smart working. And I don't know whether they've been allowed to continue long enough. Were they allowed to be absent without having to sacrifice days of annual leave or without being prejudiced because of being absent from the workplace and risking in the longer term even losing their jobs? So could you comment on that? And also people who needed to have face-to-face contact, like people working in supermarkets, taxi drivers, bus drivers, obviously hospital staff. All these people who had to be in contact with the people were exposed to high levels of COVID. And a lot of these people were vulnerable. Many of them lost their lives. And there is no possibility for smart working if you're a doctor or a nurse or not even much as a teacher when the schools are in class. And some of these people have found that they don't have any leave and that they're being prejudiced because they're being discriminated against, and they're running the risk even of losing their jobs, of being dismissed because they haven't been present in the workplace a sufficient number of days. So I'd be interested to hear some comments on that. Health is not a cost, it's an investment, and therefore I think we need to realise that, and everybody needs to pull together and stop cutting the health budgets, stop imposing austerity in the health sector, because that is simply taking away valuable assets. We should be removing health investment from the Stability and Growth Pact calculations so that it's ring-fenced and exempted. Could you also please comment on the way COVID has been basically weaponized in a number of countries? That includes Italy, by the way, to discriminate against workers who simply decided that they did not want to get vaccinated. They weren't even allowed to go to work for a couple of days. For example, members of parliament could come here with just a test if they did a test on with a certain frequency, but some of these workers were not able to work at all. Some of them were sacked. They obviously had no pay. Only some of them were allowed to come back. But of course, if they were able to come back, for example, to libraries or whatever, they were often demoted, or they were forced to go and work in some dark corner in order not to have contact with the staff who were working there. So could you comment on all these questions, please?
Thank you very much. Yeah, where to start? Madame Trollet-Lenoir, you mentioned that there is a need for more training, more staff, more resources, and I do think you're very right. And much that happened during the COVID era or period was very much that whatever the situation was before, you find yourself having much more of it. It was also on a personal level. It could be if you were living with small kids, as I'm doing. You had an awful lot of small kids in your life. And if you were working or living by yourself, you had an awful lot of that. And if you found yourself in a workplace that didn't function very well, it suddenly became a very dysfunctional workplace. And I do think that what we see now is much clearer things that are problems on the labor market, and training, resources, and more stuff is certainly things that needs to be addressed. COVID as an occupational disease, well, it essentially means that the recommendation for member states is that it is an occupational disease, that you are qualified to, just as you would have other diseases happening to you coming from work. So it has to go through the national laws and so on, but the recommendation now is clear. It is an occupational disease. On Amato, yeah, I'm not sure what to say. The last thing you mentioned is the question of discrimination, and I think if you've chosen not to vaccinate yourself, it's a tricky issue because, of course, as an employer, you are responsible for the health and safety of the people that are working there, and if you can't guarantee it, because someone chooses not to vaccinate themselves, well, then you have a problem as an employer, and I think that's where you get into a lot of difficult discussions, and I'm not sure this is the time and the moment to get into that, but I think I'll stop there and let Jan Willem continue.
Thank you for the various questions and for the positive feedback as well. You're right, of course, Madame Trollet-Lenoir, that the pandemic exacerbated, put in more focus the staff shortages, which were indeed pre-existing and which, as you were saying earlier, are continuing. But it is a crisis in Europe now. The lack of staff for health and for care, it is a crisis. I mean, if we don't address that, we will lack care. And of course, referring back to the earlier question, how to address this is an issue of funding. You mentioned, Mrs. Amato, the issue of austerity and to take out health and care finance from the European economic governance rules and to ensure that there is investment and funding, public funding for that. And of course, we do agree with that. It's strengthening our social protection, strengthening our public services because they are the backbone of our societies. For addressing the issue of protection of vulnerable workers, also here it is important that there are collective agreements which ensure that workers are covered by protection in the workplace. A collective agreement can give. And one measure which could be taken, which has been addressed in this House, is to make that also part of public procurement rules. The need, if you have a public contract, to have a collective agreement. Klaus Meijko already reacted to the very difficult question of vaccination. And we have been in favor of vaccination, of voluntary vaccination. We have indeed seen that the whole issue became weaponized. I think you coming from Italy will know that the head office of one of our unions in Italy a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, was attacked by people who split off during an anti-vax demonstration. So that is not, I think, the way we want to go. And indeed, that you could say COVID-19 was weaponized, and I was present about, almost a year in the beginning of October at the opening of the offices of our trade union colleagues, and that was a very sad moment to see. So we have also supported the campaigns, I think also supported in this House, of addressing misinformation, disinformation around those questions. And I think it is very important to provide correct information to people. The other issues have been addressed by Klaus Michael. It is an issue of addressing at the workplace through the health and safety measures we can take there. A last point on this. It is a complicated question, as you mentioned. You have to balance lots of issues with, as you mentioned, the right to health. And also the European Court of Human Rights actually expressed itself on this issue, which I think has also been acknowledged in this House. So.
It is absolutely a very delicate balance that you have to seek. And I also think it's very important in the light of future pandemics, although we hope there will not be, that we do reflect. Yeah, but we need to be prepared. That's what this committee is all about. So, Mrs. de la Pisa.
Bueno, pues hoy se ha hablado mucho de.
So, thank you very much. Thank you very much to our guests today. I will be speaking in Spanish. Today we've talked a lot about doctors. And a lot of the testimonials of doctors have been very overwhelming. They've talked about how they've had to protect themselves using plastic bags because they didn't have access to PPE. So, in trade unions, what can be done when you're facing a situation like that? It was seen as normal for doctors to work without the right kind of protection. And so perhaps people who don't work in the health sector might not understand it, but it's almost like someone who works on a building site to work without protective equipment or a harness, for example. And so that increases the risk of the spread of COVID in those circumstances, and the consequences of that have been quite significant. Perhaps the shortage of doctors, which we had already seen before the pandemic, has been worsened because of those conditions that they had to face. I have a lot of contact with doctors, and they often talk about PTSD. It goes much further than burnout. These are people who are affected in the long term, and they're very committed to their vocation. They want to go back to work, but they don't feel able to. I'm talking about people who tremble at the thought of going back to hospital. There are some healthcare professionals who have had to face very dramatic circumstances, and they haven't really been able to process that. So what initiatives do we have for these doctors who were on the front line? And in fact, a lot of doctors had to work in care homes alone, and that was very difficult for them as well. This is a situation that we have seen developing over time, and it's come to a head right now. We've seen how doctors have been subject to a great deal of pressure because they have had to run their clinics in a very strict way. And so where is that freedom for them to decide? They only have 5 minutes to talk with their patients. There are a series of very strict protocols in place. No one can ask questions. So doctors with a real vocation will know that this can be very restrictive for them. We're seeing this with vaccines as well. We're not allowed to ask questions about vaccines. We can't question the possibility that perhaps vaccines aren't always the best option, because we're just seeing in hospitals how doctors wanting to do the best for their patients, but they have to follow a very strict protocol that is enforced in hospitals. And if they don't, then they are marginalised by their bosses or by their colleagues. So what's the impact on hospitals?
Thank you very much, Ms. Della Pisa. Mrs. Matias, please.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank the guests here today and thank you for your presentations. You also highlighted some very crucial issues, and they're often neglected. You talked about the feminisation of domestic care work in general. And I think this happens in all our countries. We recently had a mission to Italy, and we saw that. We saw how care centres, care homes were predominantly staffed by women, and domestic workers are generally women as well. And that means that this kind of work is undervalued often. And not only in terms of salary, but in terms of recognition. And so I wanted to ask about how we can continue to insist on women having that recognition in terms of their salary and being acknowledged in that kind of work. I'm also glad that you talked about the role of trade unions. I think during the pandemic, that has really highlighted the importance of trade unions, and we're seeing now how important it is in Europe to reinforce the role of trade unions during the crises. And you also talked about how many workers on the front line during the pandemic had to face very precarious circumstances, and they weren't protected in their workplace. And we know that these precarious circumstances and this lack of protection dates back quite a long way. It didn't just happen during the pandemic, but the pandemic made the situation a lot worse, and a very high number of workers lacked protection. And so my question for both of you is that, given that we understand now the situation regarding precarious work, flexible work, and a lack of protection, what structural measures do we need to develop and take into account so we don't face a similar situation to this in the future, where employment has become so fragile? Thank you.
Mr. Staal.
Yes, thank you very much. I think in terms of preventing, starting with Mrs. Matias, and thank you for your positive comments again. Starting with your question of how do we prevent that workers are not valued, the women who deliver health and care are not valued enough. I think that is what I started off by addressing. That needs also a collective response of us. It's not just the situation of one hospital or one care home. It needs a collective response and a collective approach, starting with the recognition of the work they do and the value of their work. And that means also, when we talk about public budgets, it means financing for those services. I think I mentioned that one of the fact that there is still, that tomorrow we celebrate equal pay day, or I should maybe say unequal pay day, a large part of the inequality in pay or the lack of women catching up is due to the fact that in care women are not, the work of women is not valued appropriately. And that also means recognizing the role of the trade unions, the instruments of trade unions with employers and in discussion with the governments. I mentioned it before, collective agreements. Klaus Michael mentioned social dialogue, workplace representation. That's also partly a response to Mrs. Margarita della Pisa Carrion, I hope I pronounced that correctly, when you talked about doctors. First, I would say it's not only about doctors. We talk about a one-team approach, the doctor, the nurse, up until the cleaner, often women, who also has to ensure that the hospital or the care home is clean. That is as important for many of them. They saw some people in the workplace getting full protection, but others themselves not. Whereas the virus was circulating, etc., in their workplace. So certainly, I think one of the measures now in the European Union which is addressed is having storage of personal protective equipment, so that we are better prepared. We were not prepared. I mean, I think we have to face that. Ensuring that there is training and better training protocols, safety protocols which are available, and also discussing that with the unions. I can only agree with you that, and we heard that in the testimony we had in that meeting here in the European Parliament, the dedication of the health and care workers in those difficult moments was phenomenal, no? I mean, they knew they were going to be exposed, and still they came back to their place of work to help the people they had to take care of. And I think I started by acknowledging that, and I do that here again. You mentioned many workers, doctors, but also nurses and other staff suffering from PSTD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That is true. And many of those workers feel exhausted. I mean, they're completely knackered, if that's English, in what they do. They have to catch up. They cannot provide the care they would like to provide. And that's why many leave. I mean, we did research, and about 420,000 workers have left the sector in 2020, 2021. I mean, 420,000 people who left a sector which already had staff shortages, as we also heard. So I think we need a collective response to that, and I hope that's one of the conclusions of this committee, to value that work. It is addressed in the European Care Strategy, but we have to go further in doing that. And I hope they haven't watered down, the ministers haven't watered down the care strategy, the long-term, the recommendation on long-term care. I hope they haven't watered it down.
We hope the same.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Madam Matthias, for lifting the workers on the front line. And I think one of the early insights were just how the change of understanding what is important work, because it turned out that the work that was most undervalued, I would say, turned out to be the most essential work that was needed to be done in order to make our society hold together during this period. I think that was a wake-up call in many ways. And I forgot to mention the tight labor issues that we're dealing with right now, which so well illustrates the situation that many conditions, in many places, the work was not paid enough, bad conditions, bad in terms of safety, and many other things. And I do think that these are the things that we need to address in the future. How we make our jobs safer, how we get better wages, how we get more resources to our workplaces, and simply create better conditions for work. And then to Madame de la Pisa, well, I'm not an expert in hospital care and so on. I think Mr. Gudrian, my colleague, addressed some of the issues, but I do find it a bit provoking when you talk about doctors only in this case, because I will tell you that my mother is a nurse, and she almost died in COVID during this period. So it's a bit insulting the way that you're framing it, talking only about doctors. And I would strongly advise you not to do that again. Having said that, it's very much about the resources. It's about creating conditions that makes the staff able to do the work they're set to do, and that was lacking definitely in the beginning of the COVID era. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. For the last round of speakers, I have on my list Mrs. Olson, Mr. Orville, Madame Rivasi. Anybody else? Meneer Roos? Yeah, you're on my list, Miss. Yeah, Mrs. Olsen, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will continue in Swedish. Jag vill börja med att tacka våra inbjudna talare.
So thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank our speakers. You did address some very relevant issues. You spoke about what happened in the past and you spoke about the future. I'd like to talk about the situation of women on the labour market. Even before the pandemic, there were many studies that showed that women's working conditions were particularly difficult, particularly in sectors where there are many women working, like in the health sector. And with the pandemic, the situation got worse. The working conditions, labour conditions, particularly for women as well. And they were in the front line often. They were in direct contact with the virus. So they had to go to work nonetheless. And then there is an exhibition, in fact, that highlighted this. So it's very difficult for women, and there's a lot of inequality. There's a pay gap between the men and women. There's no real work-life balance either. So a question for both of you. You did touch on it, but let me come back to it. So what lessons can we learn from the pandemic? How can we ensure that these situations don't arise again in future? And then, we need a good social dialogue. We need an agreement, a collective agreement. We need to ensure that what we have in place is right, and what has happened with the social dialogue as a result of the pandemic, and how can we improve the situation in future in relation to all this? Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much. I shall be speaking French as a speaker. So, the COVID-19 pandemic really was a massive upheaval for workers. Many workers had to stay at home. Others had to go into work despite the health risks of that. Now, public health services were very badly hit by this. So you represent public services, and what has been the result of the pandemic in terms of the protocols that are needed in the health sector? Many difficulties were encountered with decision making. Social partners weren't always involved, didn't always participate. Were you consulted when it came to introduction of protocols and as to when they should be lifted at the end of the pandemic? And in terms of lessons learned, do you think that public services are now well prepared for future crises on a similar scale? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Rivasi.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rivasi.
Merci, Madame la.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'd like to thank the trade unions for being here as well. I'd like to talk about the staff who were dismissed or who saw their contracts suspended because they refused to vaccinate. 130,000 workers in France, all different categories. And at European level, I've seen that some countries like Italy and Greece are wondering as to whether the staff should be rehired. In America, there have been some court cases asking for them to reintegrate it with compensation. In Canada as well. So my question for you is, what did you do to defend workers' rights and their dignity? Because it's not a case of whether they're in favour or not of vaccinations. You should be defending employees, workers. and the workers had nothing. They had no wages and no compensation, no access to unemployment benefit. I've met these people and they had nothing. And, you know, I think that's they were mistreated. They really were. That's my opinion. So what would you recommend in terms of these workers who were dismissed or had their contracts suspended? And what would you do if there were a new pandemic to ensure that these workers were recognized, had better working conditions? Because, you know, when you have a pandemic, it's not just about vaccinating people. It's about having staff to look after patients, to do the diagnosis and so on. And I think that your role is very important in all that. So what would be your recommendations in the case of these people who've been suspended for work? And how would you improve the working conditions and living conditions of these workers? You know, we used to clap them, didn't we, every evening, and then they suffered discrimination. Thank you very much, Mr. Nero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question, and it's in addition to the question of Mrs. Revesi. Many unvexed workers were discriminated in European countries, especially in the healthcare sector, but in some countries more broadly. Now we do know this was a mistake. The inoculation does not stop the COVID transmission. Governments and companies were wrong to exclude these people. We must learn from that, and it should never happen again. In that perspective, do you think it would be good for the employers and governments to issue an apology for discriminating against these workers? Thank you very much.
And the last for this hearing, part of the hearing, Ms. Kutayar, and then you have final.
Thank you much, Chair, and thanks for our speakers for being here with us today. Sorry for not being able to follow the first part of the presentation, but I was stuck in votes in another committee. But I wanted to bring also this question and contribution to today's discussion. Frontliners are in the healthcare sectors, but we also had frontliners in the transport sector. And here, for example, I would like to refer to the seafarers who are facing precarious situations with different realities. Some were stuck at home, unable to provide for their families and go to work, but others were stuck at sea, on ships, sometimes even beyond the end of their original contracts and unable to be repatriated due to COVID-related restrictions. Then we had also other workers involved in the supply chain of essential goods, especially truck drivers, for example, were faced with a very difficult situation during lockdowns, with all facilities to rest, eat, or most of them at least, being closed, and therefore this impacted their work. And therefore I wanted to refer specifically to these essential transport workers who are very much important too, because on transport we depend for imports and exports and for essential food and supplies. And my question here is, what should be done at an EU level from your perspective to ensure that such a situation will not repeat itself during another pandemic or another crisis? Because after all, this committee relates to learning COVID lessons, but this applies not only to other pandemics, but also to other shocks and crises within our system, and how we make our socio-economic aspect resilient. Thank you.
Absolutely. How important the care workers were. They were absolutely key, but also the other workers had huge effects. But since a lot of questions went about healthcare, I start with you, Mr. Gouderian, and then Mr. Staal, you can answer on the other questions. And the floor is final answers.
Thank you. I think I'm trying to order a little bit the questions. Mrs. Olsen, for your question about women on the labour market, the continued existence of the pay gap, the importance of work-life balance, and the lessons we can draw from the pandemic. I think there are currently a number of measures in discussion, also around the gender pay gap, which rapidly need to be adopted, even improved on the proposal of the European Commission, I would say. I already addressed the issue of social dialogue and collective agreements, which I also think is an answer to the question of Mrs. Rivasi. I think I appreciate that you acknowledge the important role of trade unions and workplace representatives to address this question also of discrimination at the workplace. And many of my colleagues had to deal with all these questions, as Klaus Michael also say. That's why we don't have a position on mandatory vaccination. All the situations are a bit different. What is important, though, is the role of discussions at the workplace between the employer, between the trade union, between the workplace representatives, often the health and safety committees at the workplace to address those issues. And that obviously also implies for the aftermath of what happens with workers who feel discriminated against them. And I hope they also turn to the unions to discuss those things. In terms of the question of Mr. Orville, thank you for stressing the role of public services, le service public. And again there, I fully agree with you that it is important that the social partners are involved in all those discussions, that trade unions, but also our employers, are part of the discussions we have with governments, and to be well prepared. I think that is a recommendation possibly this committee could do. To be well prepared is for employers and trade unions to go through their protocols, how to address those situations. In many cases they are now there, but are they bulletproof? Are they covering all the situations? And for public services themselves, I think it is an issue of funding, as we do know. I mean, many public services have been underfunded, and it is important that we value them as well as our social protection systems for the future. And again, I hope that is a recommendation of this committee to invest in our social protection and invest in our public services, including in health and care. And that, I think, you will address some of the other questions. But it also applies to urban transport, to our public transport systems, for example.
And I'll try to continue here. Yeah, so for Carina Olsson, you really put the finger on something that is important, and that is that we don't lose track of good developments that we had before the crisis, and that we don't fall back in the way that the women's rights become less important, or that inequality goes up instead of down. And I think that many of the things that I'm saying now will also connect to the question you raised on seafarers and truck drivers and so on. And it is very much about making, first of all, awareness of the situation, but secondly, also ensure that there are resources to deal with the issues. And thirdly, to ensure that we have rules that are properly addressing the issues that we want to achieve. And fourthly, and that connects to Mr. Always' issue on consultation, I think there is also a great importance, which also connects to what Madame Rivasi is mentioning, is to involve social partners, to involve trade unions at all levels and in all situations. Because one of the things that I do think one can looking backwards, you live life forward, you understand it backwards, but looking backward, I do think that where the social partners were involved in the measures that were taken, they were more successful in the long run. So more social partners, and just as John Willem said, I think that's an important conclusion that we hope to see from this committee, is that it is useful. And then, yeah, I think I'll stop there.
I am sorry, but vous êtes trop vague. I am sorry, but vous ne répondez pas.
I'm sorry, you're being too vague. You're not answering the question.
Mrs. Rivasi, in the sense that the situation is very different in different member states. It's not like there's one policy. I do remember the situation in the country I know best. At a certain moment of time, there was a discussion about obligatory vaccination in the healthcare sector. Then it didn't went through, and it was like a lot of evaluations. And what I think is important, as I said before, and also for us to reflect when we write a report, when we all will discuss the report, is how do we look at the future? And also for the unions, how to assess looking at the future when it comes to, there will be situations in the future. We don't know exactly what it will be. Will it be about vaccination or other medicines, or we don't know, but it is something completely new to reflect upon, and I think we need to take that back. Yes, if you want to. I have to conclude this hearing.
One thing we will do is look at what we have said on vaccination schemes, and if we have a position, send that to you, so that you are better informed. I think I did not respond to the question of the gentleman behind you with regard to the Mr. Rose, with regard to the question if employers and government should apologize to workers. I mean, maybe that's something to reflect on. I would say, let's think of a European day in which we remember the work which has been done by so many people during the pandemic. A real European day of remembrance, which I think I would say is more of a priority here. But that's obviously a point for further reflection, as I think you also mentioned in other questions, no?
Okay, we'll come back to that. Now we have the employers, so you can raise these questions as well to the employers. But thanks a lot for being there. I think it was a very interesting hearing, very open-minded, a lot of questions, and you gave us a lot of proposals for recommendations to put in our report, and so we will for sure reflect upon them. Thank you very much, Mr. Gouderian and Mr. Saal. And I invite the employers' organizations to come to the front.
And thanks for the members of taking the time to be in discussion with us. No? Thank you.
Okay, dear colleagues, I know it's very intensive all, having like... I always like to do that. I always like to do that. Mrs. Rivasi, you're the vice chair of this committee. Huh? Okay, so let's proceed. It's very intensive. We started at 3. We're at the last set of hearings, the last of the 3 hearings that we had today, with the representatives of the employers. First of all, I'd like to welcome Mrs. Christina Soder Haslund, Health and Safety Manager, Confederation of the Danish Employers Federation, I guess. So, yeah. And Mrs. Veronique Willems, of the Secretariat General of SME United. And thanks a lot for being here. It's amazing, 2 men for the unions, 2 women for the employers.
Take notes.
So welcome, and I'm going to give you immediately the floor to give your introduction so that we can move on to the question. Mrs. Haslund, you have the floor for 10 minutes around.
Thank you. Jeg vil tale på dansk.
Thank you very much. I'll speak Danish. First of all,
Thank you for the invitation to take part in this important hearing today. Just briefly about me. It's true, I am a representative of the Confederation of Danish Employers. For the private sector, this is the main employers' organization, and politically I'm responsible for occupational health and safety. So I was one of the responsible persons in our confederation in the COVID-19 task force, one of the government's task force to be able to handle COVID-19. And I was involved in the development of guidelines for different sectors to be able to handle COVID-19. I would like to tell you a bit about some of our important lessons. And as you have heard today, it's very complex. There are many nuances, and we can't do all of them, but I think I'll tell you about 3 of the most important lessons from a Danish perspective as an employer, and then I'd look at the European perspective afterwards. What we have learned, first of all, in Denmark is that a robust tradition of social dialogue and tripartite negotiations about labour market issues in Denmark made it possible to quickly agree on ways to support workers, companies and self-employed in handling and surviving the crisis. As it has been said by the 2 speakers before me, the social dialogue, early on in the dialogue, it became very clear that the handling of COVID was not just about treating it. It wasn't just public health. It was just as much a question of how we could effectively prevent infection in society at large, but in particular at the workplace. And in the workplaces, it was through our occupational health efforts. So we could keep the wheels turning and ensure that companies wouldn't have to shut down. Effective prevention at companies is where both employees and managers take ownership of the effort, and this is most likely to succeed when general guidelines are supplemented with the possibility of involvement, dialogue, and tailored solutions at the company level. In Denmark, the formal and informal cooperation systems really supported us in this regard. The social partners were involved at a high level and delivered approximately 13 or 14 tripartite agreements about COVID-19, also about how to compensate for wages. We were involved in and were heard in new legislation and new central guidelines. At company level, employees and management in their working environment organizations or work committees developed local solutions within the framework they'd been given. And as I said, I was a member of a task force on corona infection, and several sectors had partnerships, and they looked at guidelines for COVID-19 in each of those sectors. The involvement and dialogue with social partners gave us a flexibility and agility in the handling of COVID-19. For example, some of the tripartite agreements were reached in just 1 day. But most importantly, it gave us a really strong ownership and a responsibility for finding a viable solution among all parties. The second thing we learned that I would like to talk about today is that a high degree of digitalization in Denmark made us agile in handling the crisis. Denmark quickly established an efficient system for testing, test results, and vaccinations. The systems were supported by quick development and use of apps. in Denmark. There's a general high degree of digitalization and digital skills in the Danish households, employees, authorities, and companies, and this made it relatively easy for many employees to work from home from day one. And that was a recommendation from the Danish authorities at the time. As much as 40% of the employed Danes worked at home during the actual COVID-19 lockdown. That is a record high level. We can see, not only in Denmark, but in the rest of Europe, that working from home or hybrid work or so-called telework is here to stay. So this taught us a few things that we need to learn from and use in the future. For many, it became clear how important it is to have a job and how important it is to have colleagues, how important it is for a mental well-being. It wasn't really fun to be working from home for so long. It also made new demands on management and distant management. And we started a lot of discussions about how hybrid work, in some ways, can support a better balance between work life and private sphere, which also has to do with climate debates and a more mobile work or labor market. You could be working from home, and this was open to some groups in the labor market who hadn't had it before. The third thing we learned was that the demand for quick decisions and rule-making actually challenged the legal certainty in our parliamentary system. It became clear that there was a general need for special COVID-19 legislation, but we just didn't have a very uniform handling of it throughout the authorities. In some areas, we used the legislation we already have. In others, we developed new legislation that was particularly thought for the crisis. But unfortunately, some of these legal requirements in the companies meant that there was a certain uncertainty about how to implement it. There was uncertainty about the rules in the specific workplace. There was uncertainty about how authorities would use it. These were the Danish lessons learned. What we learned at a European level is that it's really essential to have a close coordination level at EU level when dealing with a crisis like the pandemic. That goes without saying, but it is easier said than done. As an employer, it is a major issue that the free movement of people and services were severely restricted by national confinement and quarantine measurements, and that these varied so greatly between countries for travel documents, tests, and we didn't know precisely what travel restrictions were. Also, the lack of coordination at the beginning of purchase of personal protective equipment and a lack of prioritization for which sectors should have been first in line to receive protective equipment, which was something the two speakers before me also talked about. And it was a challenge that the EU Commission's approval of the Danish wage compensation schemes was so delayed, because EU state aid rules should never act as a direct obstacle to national compensation schemes in a force majeure situation. However, there are also a number of examples at EU level that we really should follow going forward. Free movement of goods and critical health staff was quickly facilitated through the establishment of the so-called green corridors. EU OSHA played an important role regarding guidelines and information to enterprises about preventive measures for COVID-19, which the nation states, member states, and employers could, and employee organizations could continue to cooperate on. And with the COVID certificate and the QR codes there, it was possible for the EU to create a common digital certificate to benefit both administration, companies, and citizens, and that is definitely something we should use going forward. when we look ahead at an EU level, it would be very important in an effective handling of health crisis to have data at a European level that we can compare and use. We don't just need digital infrastructure, we also need the digital skills in the population. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Very much for this introduction, and I give immediately the floor to Mrs. Willems, please.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, also thank you for the invitation. I think it's very good to also stop for a second and look back on what we can learn and improve towards the future. I would like to briefly introduce SME United for those who don't know us yet. We were previously called UAPME. Maybe for some of that bell still rings. We are the organization of crowds and SMEs in Europe. We have member organizations in all EU member states except the Czech Republic. I'm working on that one still. Sorry, Martina, I'm just looking at you. We also have member organizations outside the European Union in Norway, Ukraine, Turkey, Andorra, and the UK. And we also have European sectoral organizations, SME organizations. So we have a broad scala of organizations. And the moment we saw in February 2020 what was going on in Italy, and we learned from our Italian members what was happening in their cities and villages, we immediately started with a weekly call among our member organizations, and that was immediately done in a digital format. To listen to our Italian member organizations, which measures were being taken there on confinement and so on, all measures on the work floor. Immediately also started exchanging with the other organizations and also looking into which support measures would be required for small companies to survive that confinement. Because, of course, the confinement was necessary to make sure that people would survive the pandemic. But on the other hand, it had a massive impact on small companies who had to stop their activities and couldn't get any resources anymore. Just to give you a few numbers, at that moment we got a total of 30% of SMEs that reported that their turnover suffered at least an 80% loss. An EU average was about 50% of loss in turnover. Giving you a few examples, Belgium reported a decline in turnover of 72% of the SMEs, and for 28% of the SMEs, the loss was higher than 75%. In Germany, we had a report of a decline of 50%, and France and Spain a decline of 80% and 75% in the confined sectors. Of course, that immediately also had an impact on the unemployment rate or in the possibility for companies to keep their teams active. And I would like to highlight the word active because you know that SMEs have been struggling already for years to find skilled staff and to complement their teams. So the first thing that entrepreneurs were trying to do was keep their staff on board, even though there was no activity in the company anymore. And that's why we also immediately asked for compensation measures from the authorities, providing liquidity for those who needed it. Of course, we also saw many entrepreneurs who invested their own savings again into their companies to make sure that they could keep their staff on board and the company afloat. We also saw that the short-time work scheme started popping up across the European Union. For those member states who didn't have experience yet, we immediately also had exchanges from our other members who have a lot of experience with those schemes to provide criteria, eligibility criteria, measures on what could be provided to employees, and so on and so on. An important element that was also raised at that moment was to ensure in training, if that was needed, for persons who were out of a job for a temporary while. And then we also saw income subsidies, which is an important one for self-employed who lost their revenues and hence also their income and their livelihood. I'm not going to go into the detail. I have a specific example from the HoReCa sector. If we have time later on, I'm happy to go on deeper into that as well. I would like to put forward 5 lessons learned that we take out of the COVID pandemic at the European level. The first one is if such a pandemic would happen again or a similar event, of course, preserve jobs. I will get more into detail later on. A second one is to support self-employed, especially for the most impacted sectors. A third one is to adopt the occupational safety and health measures, what we also heard from the colleague from Denmark. A fourth one is supporting the most fragile populations, and we're thinking specifically in this European Year of Youth on young people, and those with health problems, of course, as well. And then a final point is the involvement of social partners at all stages and levels. First element, preserving jobs. As I mentioned, SMEs have been struggling to find skilled staff, so they were not keen on letting their good team fade away during the pandemic and made most efforts possible to keep them on board. So the short-time work schemes were a very important tool for companies to do that. We were very happy that throughout the pandemic, we also saw that duration and eligibility criteria were extended and prolonged. As I already mentioned, during that unemployment period, we also saw with public employment services taking action to provide trainings where possible, online, on the job, in training centres when allowed, which was also a very important element, I think, to prepare the workers' population for the digital and the green transition while we were stuck in the pandemic. Investing in the development of potential new ways of working, what has been raised as well, we saw that a lot of people had to shift to online working, to digital and remote working. For some, it was already easy because they were already a bit adapted. For others, it was a huge jump. I always said that the COVID pandemic was the push that small companies needed to digitalize. And I now also say that Mr. Putin completely miscalculated and gave an additional push on the energy transition, although I would prefer that he now stops with the push. It's okay. What we saw when the activity was picking up again was that we needed flexibility and incentives for working time, such as overtime and shift work, where also the engagement of social partners to find an agreement was very crucial, because at a certain point then there was a lot of work to be done in certain sectors, and then the agreements among social partners on overtime and working in shifts was also a very important one. And of course also during the pandemic itself, when we had the health and safety risks and we wanted to keep factories going at a certain rate, taking into account distancing rules and so on, that was an important element as well. Ensuring free movement of cross-border and seasonal workers has been a topic. My colleague already mentioned it, that the closing of the borders and the difference between member states in certificates and testing and tracing did play did create an incredible hurdle for some workers and entrepreneurs. And then deconfinement measures, of course, cannot be a one-size-fits-all. It also depends on the sector, the activity, and so on. Of course, we are very happy with the SURE mechanism that was adopted at a quite high speed, and also the other measures that were taken in the reshuffling of resources between the different funds to make sure that they could be invested where necessary. If we look at the future, tools that have to be adopted at European level to support short-time work schemes, I have 3 points to take into account for the future. They have to be adopted and activated as soon as possible to be immediately applicable. We need to make sure that there is a support to self-employed to compensate their loss of income, and also top up on support if necessary. And a third element is to provide clear guidelines to member states on how to best use and implement those tools. The second point, and that's a very important one for SME United, I guess I will be also the only one raising it here today, that's the support to self-employed. They experienced higher financial difficulties because they also had a higher likelihood to lose assignments and have a large reduction of working hours. Giving you the example of the hairdressers, the estheticians, and so on, they were closed down for months. And of course, they also lost their income at that moment. Moreover, in most member states, self-employed, and that's different to the country where we are from, they are excluded from traditional support schemes. So for many member states, they still had to start developing these kind of support schemes, which of course also took a bit of time. If we look at lessons learned towards the future, I would say that we have to make sure that we keep those templates available, that we have a possibility to provide basic income to self-employed as well. Checking national support schemes for flaws in eligibility criteria, duration and coverage. What we saw in several member states still was that, for instance, the system was based on previous turnover. But if you had set up your company 1 year in advance, there was no previous turnover to base the compensation on. There was a lot of issues as well in cross-border entrepreneurship, an entrepreneur living in Belgium, having his business in France or in Germany or in the Netherlands. That's also an element to take into account for the future. Bottlenecks hindering fast and proper dispensation of the funds. We've heard a lot of complaints from certain member states on administrative burdens, very heavy application forms for self-employed who had to figure it out either by themselves or online with supporting services. And then providing also sufficient and clear information to self-employed would be a very important one. I'm not going to go too long on the occupational safety and health because my colleague already explained that very well. I think the cooperation between social partners there was crucial with EU OSHA, with the member states, so I'm not going to go into detail there. Looking at the young people, we were very happy that Commissioner Schmid also raised there the support for young people in apprenticeships because, of course, they also lost their training places at the moment that there was a lockdown. So looking forward, we would say, again, making sure that there is sufficient financial support and administrative support for the SMEs, providing trainings and apprenticeship places for the young people, providing financial support to the training centres so that they can digitalize part of their curricula when needed and also provide digital on-the-job trainings, providing also digital equipment to the trainees. And then a last point is the involvement of social partners from the start. And I think that we can congratulate most of the member states and certainly also the European level, because I remember the first moment with the lockdown, everybody was looking, okay, what do we have to do? All meetings were cancelled. So I thought, okay, some time to think. But after 1 week, we already started receiving requests from commissioners, from the commission services and so on, to have discussions on which measures have to be put in place, what is the impact on the ground. Maybe towards future potential crises, I think it would be useful to also have a look at whether social partners get sufficient and timely information on emergency procedures, critical infrastructure and those kind of things, so that we can also inform, when necessary, our national organisations. And then a final one, general comments on the EU response to the crisis. Coordination is a very important one, and I think the Commission and the European level in general did a very good job on that one. The temporary state aid framework that was also prolonged and amended, the resources to help member states finance their programmes, the guidance in occupational safety and health. So I think all in all, with the competences that the European level had, they made the most and even more of what they could do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I immediately go to the question and answer. Mrs. Weiss.
Mange tak. Jeg vil også.
Thank you. I would also like to speak Danish today, since we have an extra Dane in the room. Thank you very much, Christina and Veronique, for your very precise recommendations. My questions will perhaps sound as if I did not listen to you, but good things can be said more than once. I have 3 questions for you. The member states are the ones that create and ensure the EU legitimacy in all that we do, especially because they are the direct connection between citizens, companies, and because policies in the employment field is and should remain state responsibility. What will you do to improve the employment policies of member states to prepare them for the future? The field of employment is very important for both families and companies. What are your recommendations nationally and on an EU level so that we together can help cross-border workers in times of crisis? And my third question, and this is something you haven't touched upon yet. My third question is that Corona, the COVID-19, has had a very definite negative influence on the private sector employment. If we are to be ready for a new crisis in the EU, what is your number one recommendation? What should we do to ensure that our productivity improves in the EU so we can have enough money for all the other issues we want to cover, such as the climate?
Please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to both speakers for sharing such interesting and important insights indeed. And here, the first question I wanted to put is relating to mental health. We speak a lot about the mental health of workers, which is much important, and we need to continue to see how we monitor this, even considering long COVID aspects and other aspects. And I think that COVID has left a bit of a mental health impact on everyone. And in this regard, I wanted to bring in another aspect. We don't speak so much sometimes about the mental health of entrepreneurs, of the business owners. And when I speak locally to several business owners who really care about the business that they built up from scratch, who really care about their workers, and who also care about the importance of protecting this aspect, this is also another aspect to take into account. And therefore, you were mentioning, Ms. Willems, the losing of assignments, for example, the fear of losing the workers, considering the fact that SMEs already have an inherent handicap to attract the best skills sometimes because of lack of resources, and also the loss of income of a business. And in this regard, I wanted to put this question: how do you see that we should address this, even as a matter of resilience for the future, to ensure that we protect the mental health of the entrepreneurs and also the mental health of workers, which are both important to make sure that there is a safe and content and productive environment at the workplace. Secondly, another question relating to the HoReCa sector. Yes, I'd be very much interested to hear more about this. And as we know, yes, the tourism sector was amongst the most impacted in this regard. And there are a lot of families and workers dependent on tourism directly or indirectly, and therefore it's important for us to see how to make this sector resilient for the future and how to learn from lessons learned during the pandemic. And my third point, Ms. Hasland has spoken about good practices of digitalization, and this is very much important. It gave workers flexibility, and I really believe that we can learn from this, and we should not discard totally or go back to the old normal, but we should adopt a sort of a hybrid model, a flexible method which does not compromise workers' rights, obviously, and that must be kept in mind. But yes, in this regard, I wanted to ask, it's true that the race to digitalization has been accelerated, and this has been commented upon. But on the other hand, technology is a challenge in itself, especially for workers, for SMEs, which requires both tangible and intangible assets. And in this regard, also investment in connectivity, but also the skills of the workers to make sure they don't fall behind when it comes to crises like this. And also in the midst of an ongoing twin transition, which will require more digital skills at the workplace. And I was wondering what were the best practices you've seen being applied by SMEs during the pandemic in the area of creating and achieving skills required. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the answers. First, Mrs. Haslund, and then Mrs. Willems, please. Yes.
Thank you very much tak for spørgsmålene.
Thank you very much for your questions. To the questions from Pernille Weiss, I can only repeat what I said regarding the possibility of the EU of helping us being better prepared for future crises. The EU, of course, should respect the division of tasks between states and the community, but the EU must ensure free movement for people, goods and services during future crises. There's no doubt that some member states closed their borders. Denmark was one of them in the beginning, and we as employers were worried economically about the possibility of companies for the chance to trade. Later, corridors were established. So in the future, it's very important that the EU focuses on keeping borders open. Another issue. We experienced that something that worked really well was, as I said in the beginning, it's not just about public health, prevent COVID-19 and handle the people who were ill. It was really about prevention, especially in the workplace. To do it well, we need central guidelines. And the OSHA, the Work Environment Agency, played a very positive role because they made overall guidelines that we could use. And we could use those guidelines in the member states. We could use them on a high-level political level and also in the individual companies. This was extremely useful. The Safety and Health Agency guidelines. We would have liked the guidelines even earlier, but that's how it is during crisis. You only understand things after a short while. But it's very important to coordinate centralized guidelines. And regarding the EU, then the question of digitalization is also very important. It is of huge importance for the handling of these crises, that you can telework, work in a hybrid manner, and the EU should really strengthen this development at an EU level, not just nationally. And regarding digitalization, it is true that there are both good and bad sides of digitalization. In some workplaces, automation, robotization, digitalization can lead to a lot of fears among employees. Will we be fired or not? But the Danish example shows that this does not lead to unemployment. The digitalized places of work will need more resources, more human resources. They just use them differently. We also noticed that in the places of work with a good dialogue, then it's no problem for the staff to accept digitalization, but you need a really good dialogue. And you need to prepare the workforce so it is ready for a new digital age. And we have to start right in primary school, to secondary school, to universities. We all need to learn how to handle technology better. And a final point regarding mental health. During COVID-19, we focused a lot on mental health. But I think that focus would have come anyway, because looking at young people, both in Denmark, also in Europe and globally, a lot of them are unhappy. And this worsened during COVID-19. They lost the social contacts in school and with friends. But we have to focus on that issue very seriously. Young people are the future, and if we do not help them along, both we as parents and as employers, then we cannot prepare well for future challenges. In our organization, Danish Employers Association, we have focused on young people, both in relation to COVID, but also because we need a national dialogue about how to help young people. It's a huge challenge to help them feel better, both physically and mentally. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, maybe on the question how we can, what we can do for member states to have the right employment policies. I think it's crucial to further invest in capacity building of social partner organizations and specifically certainly the SME employers organizations. Those are the ones who are translating the policy into daily reality with the companies, with the workers as well. So making sure that we can get the right policies on the ground and implemented in a correct way is a cooperation between authorities, between the member states and the social partners. As SME United, we are advocating strongly already since years to support this and to ensure that all member states also effectively invest in the development and the capacity of SME organizations to be at the table and to contribute at national and at European level to the social dialogue. Because, of course, we're also negotiating, and I will come to that later on, we're also negotiating agreements at the European level. Those have to be implemented at the national level as well. And then it's crucial to have the right capacity to get them translated into reality. For the cross-border workers, I think that an additional evaluation, and I think there has been a lot of adaptations done throughout the pandemic, making sure that those who were in between seats, let's say, did get something, but I think an evaluation in that matter might be interesting to see where the social security coordination still had loopholes that had to be filled. On the impact on the private sector employment and how to mitigate that, I would say, and that's immediately moving forward also to the question on the mental health, give the entrepreneurs air, give them a possibility to hire people without too many burdens. And those burdens can be manifold, and I think you have developed a few of your own the past few years. But I have worked at a regional level with entrepreneurs, and I can still remember in one of my mentoring projects, there was a couple, and they were doing refurbishment works in homes, and they had hired several staff. And at a certain moment, they come to the mentoring meeting, and the lady tells me, we have fired everybody. And I said, but why did you do that? You were growing, you were doing a good job. And she said, I couldn't sleep anymore at night. I was so scared that at the end of the month, I wouldn't be able to pay my staff. And I had to provide in so many families living. I couldn't handle it anymore. So they just cut. They started working with the two of them again and set up a freelancers network. But she couldn't handle the pressure. And she, from one day to another, they decided done. So to reply to the mental health question, I try to avoid that discussion with entrepreneurs at the moment because they have been working like hell throughout the pandemic. They are now facing huge energy prices increases. And to be honest, personally, I fear that the next thing we are going to see is a regulatory crisis because the current Commission has launched a lot of new legislation. And that will fall on entrepreneurs next year, the year afterwards. And that's an additional bump that they have to take. I mean, they have been adapting, and my president always says, we are entrepreneurs, we are used to adapting, but please give us a framework that is predictable, that we know in advance what to expect and that we can prepare, that we have sufficient time to prepare for that. And I think that's something, and that's also what we've called for in a reaction to the State of the Union. Have a look at what we have put forward on new legislation for the next few years. Look at what is reporting and so on, and assess whether you really need to have that reporting put in place by the time you ask it to be put in place. Because reporting requirements, to put that into a small company and be able to do that, it's the entrepreneur who has to figure it out, and that's an additional burden. So that's a call from me to you to have a look at that. Last one on the digitalization. You know that social partners at the moment are negotiating an agreement on telework and the right to disconnect. So we are also taking along the lessons learned throughout the pandemic and putting that into new agreements and practices.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Trélé-Lenoir, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais parler en français.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak French. I wanted to ask you about a number of points, particularly about SMEs. Ms. Aslund, and I'm terribly sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, you were talking about a number of resources that OSHA had put into place in order to assist industry. And you said that there was some delay incurred. I wonder if there are ways you think that you could improve this in the future, supposing there were to be another pandemic, supposing there were to be a crisis situation. And could you also comment on how you think the current regulatory structures in the European Union are working? Do you think they're adequate? Do you think they're fit for purpose? Or can you identify some areas where you would recommend revision? For example, biological agents. Do you think that this is something that could usefully be revised so that classification of new viruses could possibly take place more quickly? Thank you.
Mrs. Langensiepen, please.
Auch ich werde Deutsch sprechen. Ja, guten Abend, herzlich.
I'm going to speak German. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for your very detailed presentation. I'd like to comment on one or two questions. There are some very important groups of individuals we need to consider, but I actually want to focus on women. And the issue in Germany, anyway, is that the situation in terms of equality has really taken many retrograde steps in terms of employment, in terms of school, childcare, in terms of a woman organising her life. Many, many, many examples exist where we've been backsliding in terms of equality and women's rights as an individual, as an entrepreneur, as a mother, as an employee, as a freelance or self-employed worker is facing more problems than previously. It's more difficult to find care, for example, where necessary, because some of the care facilities have simply been closed down. So I would like to know from you whether you think you have lessons learned that you can usefully share with us. COVID's not a thing of the past. It still exists, even if it manifests itself in a different way. We mustn't delude ourselves. We know perfectly well that pandemics don't just appear overnight, and they leave a long tail of a worrying legacy. But I want to know about women as individuals, as entrepreneurs, as carers, as parents. I want to know whether you think that long COVID has had a particular impact and how you think this should be addressed, because we know that young people have been very adversely affected. My French colleague mentioned the fact that people hadn't been able to finish their schooling or their university career because they were sick. They may not be absolutely confined to bed, but they are absolutely ill enough that they simply can't study or they can't work, and there will be employers and workers who are suffering equally from long COVID who simply can't function as they should be able to. So what would you recommend to us? How do you see this, and what would you recommend that we do? What would you advise politicians, policymakers, legislators to do to improve the situation for the eventualities of the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank both speakers for being with us. I want to tell you, I'm not only a representative of the people, but I'm also an employee. I do this for 25 years now, working as an employee. So I see both sides of this world. I have a question for both speakers, because for SME it's different than for the bigger companies. But before I start my question, I want to say to Mrs. Soot-Haslund that I really disagree that the QR code was a good idea. I found this instrument rather discriminatory. And for Mrs. Williams, I really appreciate your concerns about new and more administrative burden because of new legislation. That concerns me too, and especially the taxonomy. Now my two questions. COVID has a major impact on the labor market. In the United States, after the pandemic, many people are looking for a job better suited their new lifestyle, either through quiet quitting or the great resignation. They want to work less and to be more flexible. Do we see the same phenomena here in the European Union? If so, how do employers deal with that? And besides the option of remote working and virtual habits, what are the good and what are the bad habits from the Corona era? What can we and what have we to take with us? Thank you very much.
Okay, Mrs. Willems and then Mrs. Haslund.
Okay, a lot of questions again. For the biological agents directive, specifically, I think that the proposal was quite quickly put forward by the Commission. I think at that moment we should have looked at it more from a rational and scientific approach from all sides to move forward quickly. And you now have a decision on this pandemic. I think that can serve as a best practice towards the future as well, if I hope we won't have to, but if needed. But experts put forward their opinion, and I must say during the pandemic I tried to find expertise in that field as well a lot to follow what they propose. In general, I think that given the time we normally need on passing legislation and proposals through the European decision-making process, we worked quite quickly. I mean, it was difficult to explain to entrepreneurs when Commission President von der Leyen announced financing for the entrepreneurs that they didn't find a bag of money at their doorstep the morning after, and that it still took a few months to really get to them. But I think all in all, I try to look at it from a positive point of view. For the position of women, and especially women entrepreneurs, yeah, I think they may have had an additional challenge. Personally, I didn't have that challenge because I was confined with me, myself, and I. So I was one of the lucky and luxurious ones. But I did hear from colleagues, and especially also, for instance, entrepreneurs in Germany who indeed had to face longer school closings than in other member states, that that wasn't an easy job. So I think it's been a balancing act in all member states on opening society and keeping schools open. And that's maybe also something that needs to be looked into more in detail for the future on how we can find the right balance there. On the quiet quitting, I wouldn't call it quiet quitting or whatever, but what we do notice, and that's something that you can see now in practice, if you go to cities, or at least I already see it in practice, restaurants, for instance, closing down in the weekends because they cannot find staff. And on top of that, they are confronted with the high energy costs, so they decide to close down. What I would like to highlight, and I think that's a very important element to take along, we are all lucky to be able to do remote work and to have virtual habits. A person that is working in a factory, in a store, in a restaurant, providing face-to-face services to customers, they do not have that luxury. So maybe we should all start appreciating those people and those entrepreneurs a bit more than we're doing right now sometimes. because I've had a discussion a long time ago when I was working at regional level with the trade unions who said that the working conditions at a bakery were not up to speed anymore. And I asked them what they did on a Sunday morning. And the reply was, we go to the baker and we want fresh bread rolls. But those fresh bread rolls have to be produced by someone. And so those difficult working conditions that that baker is imposing on his staff, de facto is imposed by all of us. So I think taking that into account, taking the reality into account for certain professions is an important thing to do towards the future as well.
Yes, i forhold til det første.
Thank you. To the first question about wage compensation schemes in a Danish connection, that was part of the tripartite agreements that we reached quite early on. Because we wanted to ensure that we had both the companies and the employees, that we could save them both, let them stay at home and let them keep their wages. And as I said, the EU approval, because of the state aid rules, were unfortunately delayed. In a force majeure situation, in a crisis situation where you need to act quickly, exactly to ensure that companies can continue to pay their employees, even though they've been sent home. That was quite unfortunate. So we might have a wish here, more broadly, that the EU would learn from it and ensure that they try to do it faster next time. But when that has been said, I think I agree with my colleague that many of the EU processes actually work very quickly, much more quickly than we could have feared. And one of those was in occupational safety and health. As you mentioned, the directive on biological agents. We had some really tough discussions between employers and employees. But we found a way through it. The way we see it, it's quite a sensible way of looking at it. How we handle biological agents now and what the consequences of it will be in the workplace. How do you do it as part of the occupational safety and health, that you have a working party where you have representatives from both sides and they discuss the important elements. So kudos to the EU system as such for solving such a complex problem. There's also an element in this that other speakers have mentioned. When you have the health sector and the staff there and the way the politicians handle the situation, our experience in Denmark was, and what I experienced at an European level in the work environment area, that there wasn't really a way of thinking about the health sector and occupational safety and health yet. That's what we needed, so that's something to keep in mind. About the QAR code, whether it discriminates as a tool, I don't think it does. I don't think it discriminates as long as it enables companies to continue to work, to let employees do their work. And there can be big national differences in how it's been handled. In Denmark, we haven't seen it as a discriminatory tool. We haven't heard employees be dissatisfied with it. We have had a Danish Corona passport, which has been used and been a very useful tool for Danes at large and as an employee. because the rule has been that the employer could ask their employees to show a corona passport, because we say that if employers are responsible for containing the contagion at the workplace, it's important for them to know whether their employees have contracted the virus or not. And that's why we use the corona passport. And people haven't felt that this was treating them differently, or there have been a few cases presented to test it vis-à-vis the employment contract, but not really a lot of criticism. We have discussed how to use the instruments between employers, organizations, and trade unions. About the quiet quitting, it's not something we experience as a Danish phenomenon. If we look at the statistics for job creation and people leaving the labor market, but of course, COVID-19 has made everyone question work-life balance, just as people have asked themselves about this in many other countries, which we actually take as something quite healthy, that people look at it. As employers, we need to discuss what work-life balance should be in general, because in the long term, the way demography is developing in Europe, there is discussion to be had also as employers of how we make it attractive for employees to stay with us. So what is a good work-life balance? And I'm sure that's something very different for future generations than it was for my parents or is for me. But we need to talk about it now so that we're prepared for the future and we ensure that young people want to join the labor market, because that will be the future for Denmark and Europe. Thank you.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to thank our guests for being here today. Some of the questions I wanted to ask have been asked already, so I will just make a few additional remarks which are related to mental health and the impact of the pandemic on mental health for workers in different areas. And this also creates a lot of new challenges for businesses who need to be able to respond to these situations, because work can be affected by problems affecting workers' mental health. And so I wanted to know whether there are any recommendations, any measures that need to be taken in order to protect those who find their mental health suffering. And are there any joint measures? Is there any kind of cooperation involved in helping people who perhaps have mental health issues? Thank you.
Very much, Mrs. Dlabajova. Yeah, normally just only say Martina.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and it's good to see you. Good to see you, ladies. Thank you for your presentations. Well, a lot has been already asked. I have just a little bit maybe more general and philosophical questions. Veronique, you are not the only one who would raise the question of self-employed, because I was ready to do it. I know that already in your SM United report, already at the beginning of the pandemics, you outlined the social economic impact of the pandemic. Disproportionate negative consequences were faced by self-employed. And yes, we know that this is because there are gaps at the EU at national level. There are different legislations at the national level for self-employed. And I think that we need to challenge this somehow. But how? My question is, do you think that the national recovery and resilience plans following the guidelines of Next Generation EU will be able to provide some targeted measures to mitigate these effects and allow swift recovery for SMEs and self-employed? How do you see this? And then I go, let's say, maybe more on the lessons learned, which was mentioned so many times, lessons learned, best practice. So I have 3 questions here. Do you feel that EU institutions and national governments now have already concrete answers? Did they learn the lesson? Because you know very well the EU institutions, you are in touch with them every day. And what your associations in member states are saying, is there some concrete answer? And I'm thinking, first, compensation measures. You both mentioned that, ladies. There are so many different compensation measures in different member states. Is there some best practice? Can we say, let's say in one member state is working better than in the other, and we should take example from that? Second, are there some studies already on this new normal? Because it was approached in a different way here. We are not going back to normal. We are in a new normal. So how SMEs are dealing with it? And my last question, just to finish with the positive, on the positive note, so we don't come out from this committee depressed. Of course, there were maybe some small positive, if we really want to be optimists, some positive developments in entrepreneurial life in Europe. I'm thinking, for example, we started, and I should not say this as a politician, but we started to think in a positive way about creative industries. And we know that 95% are SMEs, because we understood what creative and cultural industries mean, only because of pandemics. Are there some other positive examples that maybe business can use positively? Thank you so much.
Martina, we come always very happy after a set of hearings in the Coffee Committee. The last question is from Madame de la Pisa. Oh, you also, yeah. De la Pisa and Mrs. D'Amato, and then for the final answers. Mrs. de la Pisa.
Muchas gracias a las invitadas.
Thank you very much. Everything that we've discussed today has been very interesting. I wanted to go back to the first days and weeks and how business owners and entrepreneurs didn't really know what to do because we didn't know how long the pandemic would go on for. And so this uncertainty made them take very erratic decisions. It wasn't clear what they had to do. And then perhaps they ended up making the wrong decision. And if perhaps they knew how long the pandemic was going to go on for, their decision would have been different. But those decisions were often binding when it came to laying off workers, for example. And I think a lot of businesses have racked up a lot of debt, and entrepreneurs have tried to find different financial measures to find a way out of that. We know that there are EU funds, Next Generation funds, which were set up to help people, but they have been accompanied by a series of conditions, and the intention of these funds were to help people overcome the pandemic, but they focus more on investment rather than covering a deficit. But there are a lot of entrepreneurs right now who are very good managers and who have good businesses that have gone well, and then they've ended up being bankrupt. And a lot of the jobs that they created have been lost. So what can be done? If someone has demonstrated that they're a good manager, they find themselves in this situation completely by surprise. How can they overcome that? Because we've seen a lot of differences between different countries. Some have offered loans, others haven't. So how can we take stock of what countries have made good decisions and what ones could make improvements? How can we be inspired by other countries so that the ones that end up paying the cost aren't those entrepreneurs who could end up creating wealth? We have talked about mental health as well, and we know that this difficult situation is a real burden for them.
Sì, velocemente, io volevo puntare un attimo il dito.
Thank you very much. I just want to talk for a moment about tourism, about theatre, about gyms, for example, about the health, about the leisure sector, restaurants, bars, and so forth, because a lot of people have got very short-term contracts when they're working in these jobs. At least in my country, that's the case. And many of them were very adversely affected. And some of them got a one-off payment, but that wouldn't even have gone halfway towards paying their rent. And that would have been some kind of ex gratia payment, which possibly was given some months, but certainly not for the whole period. In the regional committee, we talked about how to disperse funds from SURE to assist the various regions in the member states, and we did our best. I'd also like to hear a bit more, because the trade unions didn't say much about it, about people who are about vulnerable workers. First of all, I'd like to know a bit more about how employers actually approach the need of protecting and helping people suffering from cancer, for example, or depression, or who are having life-saving treatment. They're not necessarily able to work in the workplace, and I wonder whether there's national legislation in place to let them work at home. If not, do you take action to try to facilitate this, and do you also have some plans in place to try to prevent them being dismissed?
Please, 5 minutes, because we're... Yeah. Thank you.
Tak for spørgsmålet.
Thank you. That was a lot of questions regarding mental health and aid for health initiatives. The most important factor that helps companies help their staff, well, that is that the companies know what the rules are. It's important that the guidelines arrive early, that they are well thought out, and that they have been thought out together with the social partners. They also have to be specific according to the various categories. Then these guidelines can be applied in the companies directly, and then it's important to have a dialogue in the works councils, so that you can have a dialogue at the workplace about how to handle the crisis. We experienced that this helped attenuate a lot of the possible conflicts. People, when they felt that they were listened to, accepted the limitations. Sometimes you have to do things in times of crisis that you do not really want to do, but the dialogue helped out. Clear guidelines, clear requirements of the companies, and also in the various sectors of the economy, specific guidelines, that's very important. Have we learned enough from the crisis? That was another question. On a national level, we have requested, and I think we should do it on an EU level as well. We have to look at some of the elements of what we have learned. My worry is that we have not learned enough, that we do things in different ways among the member states, that we do not have enough EU coordination. We need a framework which works all over Europe and helps companies in a harmonized way. But to have that, you need knowledge about what worked, what did not work. You also need open discussions. Are some of the tools discriminatory in nature, or are they not? Which tools have we made both on an EU level and nationally? We need to find out more about this. So we really need evaluations to be able to prepare for a coming crisis. Regarding tourism, entertainment, wellness, gyms, and the service sector in general, they were hard hit. A lot of them went broke, had to close, fire their employees. It was tough. And SURE worked well on an EU level. The national compensation measures also worked pretty well. From a Danish point of view, it wasn't enough. We couldn't completely support everybody. Looking forward in the future, I think SME United mentioned it as well. We have to look at the administrative burden, the payback options. We have to recognize that we lost some members, some companies, and some people, but we have to help them now in their present situation.
Mrs. Willems.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe on the mental health impact, also looking at it from a personal perspective. I also had doubts on how to make sure that my staff was okay. I had a lot of people who were here in Brussels without their family. Their family was far away. Some were seriously affected by COVID in their family as well, lost relatives and couldn't go to their relatives. So that's never an easy thing to do. What we had as an advantage was that the insurance company with whom we work at a certain point provided the possibility for staff to contact a psychologist and have discussion with a psychologist if they wanted to. So for me, that was a very interesting example. And what we also immediately provided to our staff members as an option to also get a bit of support. Because of course, as a manager, you're also not a licensed psychologist and you don't always know how to handle those things either. I would like to link immediately also to the vulnerable workers. There I think that I hope there is no legislation needed to manage that. I think that every employer is concerned about the health of their employees and take that into account. And for instance, having had the possibility to receive vaccination as a priority for those who were vulnerable workers was an additional possibility to make sure that we could help them return to work safe and maybe even earlier than what they would have been able to do otherwise. So I think that that's also a very good example on how we could manage there. On the challenges of the gaps at EU and national level in legislation that is still existing, I think we also have to be careful because, of course, the whole social security for self-employed is also a national matter. And it's also always a very strong discussion within SME United. Personally, being from Belgium with a very well-developed system of social security for self-employed, meanwhile, if I look back at the evolution in the past 20 years, I'm a big advocate of making sure that indeed there is that safety net. On the other hand, I also have member organizations who will say, look, we are self-employed and we take care of ourselves. So I have to balance there as well. What I do think about, and then I'm immediately also linking to the question on the racked up debt and how we can support companies that are now over-indebted and facing the next crisis. I think it's very important that, again, in this new state aid framework that has been put forward a few weeks ago, and I think meanwhile approved, but I'm not following well anymore, that there is the possibility to transfer certain loans into grants at a certain moment, making sure, because at a certain moment, even guaranteed loans are just loans, have to be paid back, and it becomes too much. And what my concern is also is that for small companies, it's also hampering their investment capacity to invest in the digital and green transition, what they should be doing now. But the possibility of the state aid framework. Secondly, early warning schemes. It might sound funny in this committee, but for me it's crucial. Making sure that there is a mechanism at member state, at regional level, that provides impartial advice to companies who are facing difficulties, helping them to see possibilities on way forward, either closing down soon enough and not making the hole bigger than it already is, or the debt bigger than it already is. Making sure that they can close down in a responsible way and not by bankruptcy, or with a bankruptcy, but early enough and not causing too many issues. Or, even better, finding a turnaround solution so that they can make their company viable again, for me is a very important thing. And that's what member states have to now really invest in. I have been seeing it from the moment that COVID started, but it's even more crucial now, because with the combination of COVID and now this, it's getting a lot. So early warning mechanisms, second chance, making sure that entrepreneurs who have faced bankruptcy can indeed, with the experience that they have from the bankruptcy, start a new business again. Make sure that they learn from the lessons that they have gotten through the bankruptcy. Also provide them psychological assistance where needed, because for those who have gone through a bankruptcy, that's not an easy thing either. So that's, I think, a combination of those two. National recovery and resilience plans, there's a lot there, but it needs to get to the people who need it most. On the compensation measures, best practices and studies on the new normal, I fear that with our member organizations, we haven't gotten around to discuss that yet, because we're already managing the next challenge. And then on the tourism, theatre and gym, I think that for that sector, it's also going to be very important to look at what has been going on in the different member states. I have seen in my country and in my personal circle, I've seen very nice initiatives with a fund being set up where people could donate money that then would be attributed to projects to keep certain cultural activities alive. So I think it's again a lesson that can be learned towards the future. Voilà. And to keep it positive, I think we have learned a lot through this pandemic, and we all hope never have to go through it again, but we take along the lessons for future challenges as well.
Well, I think that's an amazing good end of the day.
I do my best.
It's I think it was very interesting to first have the International Labour Organization and then the two parts of the social partners who often have to fight over a lot of things, but I think in this pandemic, it was one way forward, keeping the economy as functional. Sorry. Voilà, sorry for the interpreters. Voilà, what I was saying is that it was good to have first the International Labour Organization and then the two sides of the social partners who often have a fight to go when it comes to wages or protection, but not in this case. I think during the pandemic, the social partners took one line to try to keep the economy open. And I think many of the lessons learned, both from the unions as from the Employers Federation, are very interesting for us to take into account. And also still a lot of unanswered issues raised by members that we will have to address in the weeks to come. And that is, our next meeting is on Monday the 28th and Tuesday the 29th, where we'll continue our pillar on the socio-economic impact, for instance, on vulnerable people and also on young people in December. So if there are any other business, right, then I can close here. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for participating and helping us to do the lessons learned. And see you all. Voilà, yeah, absolutely, for all the efforts.